October 25th, 1854, 11:10 in the morning. Troop Sergeant Major George Smith sat on his horse in the second line of the 11th Hussars, 20 yards behind men whose names he knew by heart. 34 years old, 16 years in the cavalry, survivor of the Afghan campaigns where he'd watched light horse torn apart by Jezayels on mountain passes. The math came to him cold and automatic. 670 men, 1.2 miles of open valley. Russian artillery batteries at the far end, clear as church steeples against the morning sky. More guns on the ridges to their left, the Fedukine heights, barrels already traversing to track their formation. Still more on the causeway heights to their right, crews moving with the practiced efficiency of men who knew their work. Three sides of fire, no cover except grass and air, no support coming. No infantry to screen their advance or pin the enemy guns. Just cavalry, light cavalry at that, the kind meant for scouting and pursuit, not frontal assault against entrenched artillery. The survival rate hovered somewhere near 30% if they were lucky. 20 if the Russian gunners had their range dialed in properly. Smith had done this calculation before, in his head during long watches on the northwest frontier. Theoretical exercises that kept the mind sharp. Never thought he'd be sitting on the receiving end of his own worst-case scenario. Corporal Bradley sat to his immediate right, 22 years old, fair-haired, a farm boy from Sussex who'd enlisted 3 years back because the wages beat working his father's land. This was Bradley's first real action. The kid's hands gripped his reins so tight the leather creased. Knuckles pale as bone china. His horse, a bay gelding with one white sock, sensed the tension and sidestepped, tossing its head. Bradley corrected automatically, muscle memory from endless drills, but his eyes stayed locked on the valley ahead. Smith didn't look at him. Looking meant acknowledging what they both knew. Instead, he checked his own equipment with the same methodical attention he'd brought to every morning inspection for the past decade and a half. Saber loosened its scabbard, drawing clean when he tested it with a slight tug. Ammunition pouch secured on his right hip, cartridges for his pistol packed tight and dry. Girth strap on his mount cinched properly but not too tight, enough give for the horse to breathe hard when they ran. And they would run. That much was certain now. His gelding, a gray he'd ridden since '52, stood quiet beneath him, ears forward, waiting. The animal had seen combat before, carried him through skirmishes with Pathan raiders, where the fighting came fast and brutal in narrow defiles. This would be different. This would be worse. Sergeant Major was the rank that made you the bridge between the officers who gave orders and the men who executed them. You translated aristocratic vagueness into actionable commands. You kept formations together when panic tried to scatter them. You were the voice that cut through chaos and reminded soldiers they were professionals, not conscripts. Smith had earned his rank the hard way, starting as a private at 18, working up through every increment, learning cavalry doctrine from NCOs who'd fought at Waterloo and shared their lessons over campfire rum. He taught himself to read better than his village schooling allowed because doctrine manuals didn't come in simple language. He'd studied terrain, logistics, the capabilities of different mounts, the effective range of every artillery piece in the Russian arsenal. Knowledge kept you alive. Knowledge gave you an edge when the world turned into fire and screaming. Except today, knowledge told him they were riding into a killing ground, and no amount of professional competence would change the mathematics of three-sided artillery fire against unarmored cavalry in the open. Lord Cardigan sat alone on his horse 20 yards ahead of the first line, parade ground perfect, spine straight as a ramrod. His uniform was a study in aristocratic theater. Cherry-colored trousers, the kind you wore to impress dignitaries at a review, not the kind you wore into battle where blood and mud turned everything the same dull brown. His jacket was dark blue with gold braidwork that caught the late morning sun, polished buttons gleaming, black boots buffed to a mirror shine. The man looked like he was riding to meet the Queen, not 700 Russian gunners who were about to turn this valley into an abattoir. Cardigan had purchased his commission 35 years ago, bought his way into the 11th Hussars with family money, and climbed the ranks through wealth and connections rather than aptitude. He was a martinet about regulations, obsessive about uniform standards and parade drill. The kind of officer who could recite regimental history chapter and verse, but had never actually led men under sustained fire. His idea of cavalry tactics came from textbooks written by men who'd never seen a canister shot tear through a formation. Smith had served under worse barely, but Cardigan's particular brand of rigid obedience to orders, his complete refusal to exercise initiative or question commands that made no tactical sense, that was going to get them all killed today. 20 yards behind Cardigan sat the first line. The 13th Light Dragoons held the left, the 17th Lancers the right. Both regiments were veteran units, men who'd campaigned in India and Ireland, soldiers who understood their craft. The 17th carried lances, 9-foot ash shafts with steel points designed for shock combat at close quarters, wickedly effective if you could close the distance. The 13th were dragoons, trained to fight mounted or dismounted, equipped with sabers and carbines. Good men, all of them. Smith knew some by name, others by reputation. Lieutenant Maxey rode at the head of the 17th, a competent officer in his 30s who'd earned his place through service rather than purchase. Captain Morris commanded a troop of the same regiment, known for keeping his head when things went sideways. These weren't parade ground dandies. They were professionals, and they were about to die for an order nobody understood. The second line, Smith's line, consisted of the 11th Hussars, 110 men in dark blue tunics and black fur busbies. The 11th had a reputation as one of the finest light cavalry regiments in the British Army, drilled to perfection, their horses the best money could buy, their troopers selected for skill and discipline. Smith had served with this regiment for 6 years now, knew every man in his squadron, their strengths and weaknesses, who could be relied on in a tight spot and who needed watching. Corporal Bradley was green but steady. Private Whiteman, riding 2 horses back, was a veteran of the Punjab campaign, cool under fire. Trooper Harrison, 5 horses down the line, was young and cocky but rode like he'd been born in the saddle. They were ready for battle, just not this battle. Not suicide dressed up as a cavalry charge. The third line stretched behind them, the 4th Light Dragoons and 8th Hussars. The reserve meant to exploit any breakthrough or cover a retreat. Lord George Paget commanded them, an aristocrat like most senior officers, but one with actual combat experience and a brain that functioned under pressure. If anyone survived this disaster, it would be because Paget had the sense to pull back when the situation became untenable, if he was allowed to make that call, which, given the rigidity of their command structure, was far from certain. 670 men. Smith ran the count again in his head, habit born from years of pre-battle rituals. 670 lives about to be spent for reasons none of them fully grasped. They'd received orders. The Light Brigade would advance down the valley and attack the Russian battery at the eastern end. No clarification about why. No explanation of the strategic objective. No discussion of how they were supposed to hold an artillery position, even if they somehow reached it intact. Just orders, delivered by Lord Cardigan with the clip precision of a man reading from a drill manual. The valley stretched before them like an invitation to oblivion. Grassland, mostly flat, a few gentle rolls that provided no meaningful cover. The ground was dry, which meant good footing for the horses, but also meant the artillery rounds would bounce and skip instead of embedding in soft earth. Round shot that missed on the first impact could strike again 200 yards farther on, killing men who thought they dodged it. The width of the valley funneled them into a column formation, which made them a perfect target for enfilading fire from the heights on both sides. Artillery doctrine stated clearly that you never, under any circumstances, charge prepared batteries from the front across open ground. You flank them, soften them with your own guns first, coordinated with infantry to suppress their fire. You did not ride straight at them like you were late for an appointment, but here they were. Smith's horse shifted its weight, sensing his tension through the reins. He loosened his grip consciously, forced his shoulders to relax. The animal didn't need his fear transmitted through every contact point. Bradley cleared his throat, a nervous sound that died quickly in the vast silence of 670 men waiting for the order to advance. Nobody spoke. There was nothing to say that wouldn't sound either futile or melodramatic. Smith had seen men pray before battle, seen them write last letters, seen them joke and laugh with the forced brightness of those who knew they might not see sunset. Today there was just silence and the distant sound of Russian gun crews working their pieces, the metallic clank of rammers driving charges home. The story of how they'd arrived at this moment stretched back months, back to decisions made in London by men who'd never seen a battlefield, back to a war that most of these soldiers didn't fully understand and hadn't wanted. Russia and Britain, two empires jockeying for position in a region neither could afford to lose, but both were bleeding themselves dry to contest. The Crimean Peninsula, a rocky spit of land on the Black Sea's northern shore, had become the focal point of a conflict driven by trade routes, prestige, and the kind of strategic paranoia that afflicted great powers when they looked at maps and saw their interests threatened. The Russian Empire under Tsar Nicholas III had spent the better part of 1853 looking hungrily at the Ottoman territories, the sick man of Europe, as diplomats called the crumbling Turkish state. The Ottomans controlled the Dardanelles, the narrow straits that connected the Black Sea to the Mediterranean. Control those waters and you controlled the trade routes to India, the jewel of Britain's imperial crown. Russia wanted that control, Britain couldn't allow it. So when Russian forces occupied Moldavia and Wallachia in July 1853, using protection of Christian holy sites in Jerusalem as a thin pretext for territorial expansion, the British government found itself backed into a corner. Public opinion, whipped into a frenzy by newspapers that portrayed Russia as an aggressive bear threatening civilization itself, demanded action. Prime Minister Lord Aberdeen had spent most of his career avoiding wars, knew they drained treasuries and killed young men for outcomes that rarely justified the cost. But political pressure was a tide that drowned careful statesmanship. France under Napoleon III needed a military victory to legitimize his regime, saw an opportunity to play kingmaker in the region and curry favor with Britain. The Ottoman Sultan needed allies or his empire was finished, carved up by Russia and Austria and whoever else wanted a peace. So in March 1854, Britain and France formally declared war on Russia. The objective was straightforward enough on paper: destroy Russia's Black Sea fleet, which meant taking Sevastopol, the fortified naval base on Crimea's southwestern coast. The execution was something else entirely. The British Army hadn't fought a major war since Waterloo in 1815, nearly 40 years past. An entire generation of officers had purchased their commissions, literally bought their rank with family money and social connections, never heard a shot fired in anger, never commanded men in combat. They knew parade ground drill and mess hall etiquette, could quote regulations and recite regimental lineages. But combat experience was something they'd read about in their father's memoirs. The system of purchased commissions meant that wealth and aristocratic breeding mattered more than tactical competence or leadership ability. You could be a brilliant tactician from a middle-class family and never rise above captain. You could be a mediocre fool from a noble house and command a brigade by age 30. Lord Raglan, who now commanded the entire British Expeditionary Force, was 66 years old and had lost his right arm at Waterloo. He was a decent administrator, good with paperwork and logistics, the kind of officer who kept supply trains running and ensured soldiers got paid on time. But he hadn't led men in combat for 4 decades. His memories of war were filtered through the lens of Wellington's campaigns against Napoleon, a different era with different weapons and different tactics. He still occasionally referred to the French as the enemy out of old habit, had to be reminded they were allies now. Raglan's headquarters sat on the Sapoon Heights, a ridge 600 feet above the valley floor, which gave him a commanding view of the entire battlefield spread out like a tactical map. From up there, you could see every position, every movement, every formation. You could also lose track of what things actually looked like at ground level, where terrain features blocked lines of sight and made the obvious less clear. Beneath Raglan in the command structure sat Lieutenant General Lord Lucan, 54, another aristocrat who'd purchased his commission decades earlier. Lucan commanded the cavalry division, which meant he was theoretically responsible for coordinating both the heavy brigade and the light brigade in support of the infantry. But Lucan had spent most of his career managing his estates in Ireland, not leading soldiers in battle. He was careful to the point of paralysis, the kind of commander who second-guessed every decision and avoided risk because mistakes damage reputations. His men called him Lord Look-On behind his back, a reference to his tendency to observe battles from safe positions rather than commit his forces decisively. Raglan despised him, thought him slow and overcautious, lacking the aggressive instinct good cavalry commanders needed. Raglan was probably right, but removing Lucan would require political capital Raglan didn't possess, so the general stayed in place, making cautious decisions that preserved his forces while accomplishing little. Under Lucan, commanding the Light Brigade specifically, sat Major General Lord Cardigan, 57, who'd also purchased his way into rank and privilege. Cardigan was Lucan's brother-in-law, married to Lucan's sister after a scandal that had rocked London society decades back. The marriage itself had been problematic, Cardigan's previous marriage not properly annulled, questions about the legality of the union, tabloid gossip that destroyed reputations. The family had never recovered from the embarrassment. Lucan blamed Cardigan for dishonoring his sister. Cardigan blamed Lucan for never accepting the marriage. The two men hated each other with the kind of refined aristocratic venom that expressed itself through icy politeness and barely concealed contempt. Now they were stuck in the same chain of command, Lucan giving orders, Cardigan receiving them, neither willing to show the slightest flexibility or acknowledge any ambiguity because doing so might look like weakness, might suggest they needed the other's judgment or advice. They communicated through formal written orders when possible, clipped verbal exchanges when necessary, and mutual silence whenever they could get away with it. Officers who served under them had reported the dysfunction repeatedly. The cavalry division was being crippled by a personal feud, by two men who would rather see missions fail than give ground to each other. Raglan had received the complaints, read the reports, filed them away, and done nothing, because removing either man would create political problems in London, where both had powerful friends and family connections that could damage Raglan's own position. So the system ground forward, three commanders who disliked or distrusted each other, operating with a command structure designed for an era when aristocratic officers led through personal valor and social prestige rather than tactical competence. It was a recipe for disaster. Everyone could see it coming, and nobody with the authority to fix it was willing to spend the political capital required. The British Expeditionary Force had landed at Calamita Bay on September 14th, 27,000 troops disembarking onto a beach nobody had properly scouted, supplies dumped in chaotic heaps because the logistics planning had been haphazard at best. Ships were overloaded, horses died during the crossing from stress and disease, medical supplies were left behind or lost in transit. Winter uniforms never made it aboard because someone in London had assumed the campaign would be finished before cold weather arrived. It was amateur hour with professional soldiers paying the price. 6 days after landing, on September 20th, they'd met the Russians at the Alma River, the first major engagement of the campaign. The Russians had dug in on high ground across the river, artillery positioned to rake the approaches, infantry in prepared positions behind earthworks. The Allied attack required wading through waist-deep water while Russian guns tore apart their formations. It was brutal, bloody, the kind of fight where courage meant walking into killing zones because the plan said so. 3,000 Allied casualties, 5,000 Russian. The British won, technically, because the Russians retreated and left the field. But it wasn't the quick, decisive victory politicians in London had promised. It was a slugfest that cost lives and gained ground, but didn't break Russian resolve. After Alma, Sevastopol lay open. The city's southern defenses were incomplete, just earthworks and wooden palisades that wouldn't stop a determined assault. British officers who scouted the position begged Raglan to attack immediately while the Russians were still disorganized from their defeat at the river. "Strike now," they said, "before the enemy can reinforce, before they can turn those hasty defenses into something formidable." Raglan refused. He wanted to march around the city, establish a proper siege, wait for reinforcements and supplies to arrive by sea. It was the cautious choice, the safe choice, the choice that turned a campaign that could have ended in weeks into a months-long grind that would kill more soldiers than any battle. By early October, the British had dug in around Balaclava, a tiny fishing village with a deep-water harbor on Sevastopol's southern approach. Everything the army needed had to flow through that harbor. food, ammunition, medicine, reinforcements. One harbor, one supply road, 7 miles of mud and hills between the port and the siege lines hammering at Sevastopol's fortifications. If the Russians cut that supply road, the British were finished. Starve the army into retreat or surrender, force an evacuation that would hand Russia a propaganda victory and shatter Britain's prestige across Europe. On the morning of October 25th, that was exactly what the Russians intended to do. General Pavel Liprandi commanded the Russian forces in the sector, 25,000 infantry, 3,400 cavalry, 78 artillery pieces, a force large enough to smash through the British defenses if applied correctly. His plan was elegant in its simplicity. Attack at dawn with overwhelming force, punch through the Ottoman redoubts that anchored the British defensive line on the Causeway Heights, seize the high ground, cut the supply road, take Balaclava harbor. If it worked, the British would have to evacuate Crimea or watch their army wither and die from lack of supplies. The Ottoman troops manning those redoubts were allies, not British regulars. Turkish soldiers assigned to hold fortified positions because the British didn't have enough men to cover every critical point. 6 redoubts stretched along the Causeway Heights, small earthwork forts that held maybe 50 men each, and a few artillery pieces, including some British naval guns that had been hauled up from the ships and in place to give the positions some punch. The redoubts were spread far apart, undermanned, undersupplied, connected by a supply line that was more aspiration than reality. They were supposed to anchor the defense by holding the high ground, forcing any Russian attack to come uphill into prepared positions. But preparation meant having enough men, enough ammunition, enough food and water to withstand a siege. The Ottomans had none of that. They had courage and orders and not much else. At 6 in the morning, as the sun burned off the mist that clung to the valley floor, Ottoman soldiers in the easternmost redoubt saw them coming. Russian columns emerged from the morning haze, thousands of infantry in dark gray coats moving in parade ground formation, their alignment perfect despite the rough terrain. Behind them came cavalry, thousands more, Cossacks and hussars, whose reputation for savagery preceded them. Behind the cavalry, artillery teams hauling guns into position, unlimbering them with practiced efficiency, crews working to turn field pieces toward the Ottoman positions. The Ottomans opened fire with everything they had. Muskets cracked from the earthwork walls. The British naval guns boomed, round shot arcing toward the advancing Russian columns. But the range was too long, the targets too many, the defenders too few. Russian artillery unlimbered at 800 yards and began pounding the redoubts with methodical precision. Earthwork walls were just dirt and sandbags. They couldn't stand up to sustained bombardment from guns firing solid shot that punched through and kept going. The redoubts disintegrated under direct hits, throwing up geysers of dirt and debris, collapsing sections of wall that left defenders exposed. By 7 in the morning, Russian infantry had reached the first redoubts. They swarmed over the walls in overwhelming numbers, hand-to-hand fighting with bayonets and rifle butts, the kind of close-quarters brutality where training mattered less than numbers and desperation. The Ottomans fought. They held for minutes that felt like hours, but minutes were all they had. Redoubt 1 fell, then 2, then 3. The survivors retreated west toward British lines, dragging their wounded with them, leaving more than 200 dead behind. The Russians captured 4 positions and 12 British naval guns, a propaganda coup that would echo in London newspapers for weeks. From his headquarters on the Sapoon Heights, Lord Raglan watched it happen through his field glasses. 600 feet above the battlefield, the entire drama played out like a theater performance. Tiny figures moving across a stage, smoke rising from the redoubts, the Ottoman retreat visible as a stream of men flowing toward British positions. Raglan did nothing, sent no reinforcements, ordered no cavalry counterattack, provided no artillery support. He watched the Ottoman allies fight and die and made no move to help them. His reasoning, pieced together later from dispatches and staff conversations, was that the Ottomans were expendable. If they slowed the Russians down, bought time for the British to organize, their sacrifice was acceptable. Better to lose Turkish soldiers than British regulars. Better to let the redoubts fall than commit forces prematurely. The Ottoman survivors who reached British lines were furious, bloodied, shouting in Turkish and broken English that the British were cowards who'd abandoned them. They weren't wrong. By 8 in the morning, the Russians controlled the Causeway Heights, the ridge overlooking the valley and the supply road. They'd hauled the captured British naval guns into new positions and were preparing to move them back to Russian lines as trophies. To Raglan, watching from above, this was intolerable. Those were British guns. Captured British artillery was a propaganda disaster, a symbol of failure he couldn't stomach, a stain on regimental pride and national honor. He made a decision. The cavalry would retake the guns. The problem was what Raglan could see from the heights and what the men in the valley could see were two completely different things. The battlefield was shaped like a shallow bowl with two parallel ridges running east to west. The northern ridge, the Fedukine Heights, was held by Russians with artillery. The southern ridge, the Causeway Heights, had just been taken by Russians who were also hauling guns into position. Between the two ridges ran a wide valley, open ground with minimal cover. At the eastern end of that valley, more than a mile away, the Russians had positioned another battery of artillery, guns zeroed in on approaches, crews standing ready. From Raglan's elevated position on the Sapun Heights, the captured British guns were clearly visible on the Causeway Heights to his left, maybe a mile away, sitting in their new Russian positions. That's what he meant when he later gave the order to retake the guns. Those specific guns on that specific ridge. But from down in the valley where Lucan and Cardigan were positioned, the view was completely different. The curve of the Causeway Heights blocked their line of sight to the captured guns. The ridge itself was in the way. They couldn't see the British naval pieces at all. What they could see was straight ahead down the North Valley, the Russian battery at the far end clearly visible, and on both flanking ridges, more Russian artillery with perfect fields of fire into the valley floor. A three-sided killing ground that any competent cavalry officer would recognize immediately as suicide. Raglan didn't understand this. He assumed the battlefield looked the same to everyone, that his elevated perspective was shared by his subordinates. It wasn't. That misunderstanding, that failure to grasp how terrain could mask positions and create completely different tactical pictures depending on where you stood, was about to kill 278 men and destroy the finest light cavalry brigade in the British Army. But first, something unexpected happened. Something that should have been a template for how cavalry worked when used correctly. Something that made the coming disaster all the more inexcusable, because it proved you could win if you understood your tools and applied them with intelligence. Around 9:30 in the morning, Russian cavalry, roughly 2,000 strong, advanced toward British positions down from the Fedukine Heights. They were trying to exploit the breakthrough at the redoubts, push the British back, widen the gap in the defensive line. Lord Lucan, watching from the valley floor, saw them coming and ordered the Heavy Brigade into blocking positions. The Heavy Brigade, 900 men under General Scarlett, consisted of big men on big horses, dragoons and greys equipped for shock combat, the kind of cavalry that hit like a hammer when properly employed. They were Britain's answer to armored units, soldiers whose job was to smash into enemy formations and break them through sheer mass and violence. General Scarlett had maybe 8 minutes to prepare. The Russian cavalry was advancing in a mass formation, 2,000 horsemen with the high ground, momentum, and numerical superiority. Scarlett had 300 men in his vanguard, the Scots, Greys, and Inniskillings, caught while repositioning, facing uphill. Every tactical principle, every lesson in the cavalry manuals said he should withdraw, regroup, wait for support, create favorable conditions before committing. Scarlett ordered the charge. The Heavy Brigade spurred forward, directly uphill into the Russian mass. It was insane. It violated every rule. It worked. The impact of 300 heavy cavalry hitting the Russian front line was like watching a sledgehammer strike glass. Big men on big horses, swinging sabers in close combat, crashed into a Russian formation that wasn't prepared for the shock. The Russians had been moving in a loose column, spacing that allowed maneuver but sacrificed density. The British carved into them, individual melees erupting across the collision point, saber against saber, horses wheeling and screaming, men grabbing each other and hacking at arms and faces. It was brutal and intimate. The kind of fighting where you saw your opponent's eyes before you killed him. Within minutes, the Russian formation started to fracture. The rear ranks couldn't support the front couldn't hold against British momentum driving uphill into them. Horses panicked and broke formation, riders lost control, the neat column dissolved into chaos. The Russians broke. They turned and retreated back up the heights, pursued by British cavalry who cut down stragglers and drove the rout into full collapse. The heavy brigade had routed a force 6 times their size with minimal losses. It was brilliant, aggressive, decisive, exactly how cavalry was supposed to support infantry and exploit enemy mistakes. Up on the Sapoon Heights, Lord Raglan watched and was impressed. Down in the valley, the Light Brigade had watched too, positioned close enough to see the entire action, but far enough that they'd received no orders to support. Lord Cardigan sat on his horse, watching his rivals win glory, watching the heavy brigade accomplish what everyone would be talking about in London for months. And he did nothing. No orders had arrived directing him to support Scarlett's attack. His duty, as he understood it, was to obey orders, not to think, not to exercise initiative, not to see an opportunity and seize it. Later, when officers criticized his inaction, he had a ready answer. He'd received no orders. You couldn't blame a man for following procedure. The heavy brigade's success created a new problem for Raglan. It convinced him the Russians were vulnerable, that the enemy was disorganized and falling back, that this was the moment to press the advantage and turn tactical success into strategic victory. He looked east along the Causeway Heights and saw Russian artillery teams beginning to limber the captured British naval guns, hooking them to horse teams, preparing to haul them away as trophies. That decided it. At approximately 10:45 in the morning, Raglan turned to his aide, Brigadier Richard Airy, and dictated an order. Airy wrote quickly, his handwriting rushed but legible. Lord Raglan wishes the cavalry to advance rapidly to the front, follow the enemy, and try to prevent the enemy carrying away the guns. Troop horse artillery may accompany. French cavalry is on your left. Immediate. Raglan signed it without revision. Airy handed the message to Captain Lewis Edward Nolan, a cavalry officer who served as aide-de-camp and was known for 2 things. He was an expert horseman who'd written books on cavalry tactics and training. He also held open contempt for the British cavalry leadership's incompetence, thought aristocratic officers were wasting the finest mounted troops in Europe through ignorance and social pretension. Nolan took the message, saluted, and rode hard down the escarpment toward the valley floor, his horse scrambling over rocks and loose dirt, descending 600 feet in 6 minutes. He couldn't see Lucan's position clearly from above, was focused on speed because the order was marked immediate. When he reached the valley floor and found Lord Lucan, his horse was lathered and he was out of breath from the hard ride. He handed over the order. Lucan read it and had absolutely no idea what it meant. Lucan stared at the paper, then looked up at the battlefield in front of him. Advance rapidly to the front, follow the enemy, prevent the enemy carrying away the guns. What guns? From where Lucan sat on his horse, the Causeway Heights rose to his right, blocking his view of the positions where the British naval guns had been captured. He couldn't see them. The terrain made it impossible. What he could see was straight ahead down the North Valley, the Russian artillery battery positioned at the eastern end, roughly 1.25 miles away, and on the ridges flanking that valley to left and right, more Russian guns. Charging down that valley meant riding into a 3-sided artillery trap with no infantry support, no clear objective, and no way to hold any ground, even if they reached it. It was suicide. Professional suicide ordered by a man who either didn't understand the terrain or didn't care. Lucan looked at Nolan with genuine confusion, mixed with rising anger. Where are we to advance to? It was a reasonable question from a commander trying to understand orders that made no tactical sense from his position. But to Nolan, who'd just ridden hell-bent down a cliff to deliver an urgent message from the commanding general, it sounded like incompetence, like an aristocratic fool asking for clarification on something that should have been obvious. Nolan's face flushed red. According to multiple witnesses present, his response was delivered with barely restrained contempt. He flung his arm out in a sweeping gesture toward the eastern end of the valley. There, my lord, is your enemy. There are your guns. The gesture was ambiguous, Could have been pointing at the Causeway Heights where the captured British guns sat. Could have been pointing at the Russian battery at the valley's far end. Historians would argue about Nolan's intent for the next 170 years. Did he mean the captured guns on the heights, trying to redirect Lucan's attention to the correct target? Or was he himself pointing at the wrong objective, having misunderstood Raglan's order during his rushed ride down the escarpment? The answer died with Nolan 15 minutes later. What mattered was what Lucan understood. He looked where Nolan pointed and saw the Russian battery at the valley's end, framed by artillery on both flanking ridges. He read the order again. Immediate. Lucan was cautious, resentful, mediocre as a field commander. But he was also a professional officer who understood chains of command and the consequences of refusing direct orders from a superior. He had three choices, none of them good. Choice 1, refuse the order. Demand clarification by sending Nolan back up the heights to ask Raglan exactly what he meant. That would take at least 20 minutes round trip, and the order was marked immediate. Raglan would interpret delay as cowardice or insubordination. Lucan's career would be finished, his reputation destroyed, his name synonymous with the officer who refused to fight. Choice 2, interpret the order creatively. Assume Raglan meant something other than what the words said and act on that assumption. But Lucan had been criticized before for not following orders precisely. His relationship with Raglan was already poisonous, built on mutual distrust and barely concealed contempt. Misinterpreting an explicit order could be even worse than refusing it, could be seen as deliberate sabotage or cowardice dressed up as tactical judgment. Choice 3, obey. Follow the order exactly as written. Send the cavalry down the valley into the killing ground. Watch them get slaughtered by superior firepower from 3 directions. But the order would have been followed. The responsibility would shift to Raglan, who wrote it, and Lucan would survive politically even if his men didn't. He looked down the valley one more time, did the math in his head with the cold precision of someone who understood he was being asked to commit murder in the name of following orders. At least 12 Russian guns at the far end. Artillery on both flanks with clear fields of fire. No cover. Open ground. His cavalry would be massacred. But the order was clear and marked immediate. Lucan turned to his aide and said, "Get Lord Cardigan." The words came out flat, emotionless. The tone of a man who'd made a decision he knew was wrong, but couldn't see a way around. Cardigan arrived within minutes, sitting rigid and immaculate on his horse, parade uniform perfect despite the dust and chaos of the morning's fighting. The two men despised each other, but military formality kept their exchange cold and precise. Lucan handed him the written order without preamble. "You will attack the Russians at the end of the valley." Cardigan read the order, his face a mask of aristocratic composure that revealed nothing. Then he looked down the valley toward the Russian positions, saw the same thing Lucan had seen, did the same tactical calculation, and arrived at the same conclusion. When he spoke, his voice was tight, controlled, the sound of a man forcing words through clenched teeth. "Certainly, sir, but allow me to point out to you that the Russians have a battery in the valley on our front and batteries and riflemen on both sides." It was the most reasonable objection Cardigan had ever made in his military career, a moment of clarity where he saw the trap and tried to voice the problem without directly refusing orders. Lucan's reply has been recorded by multiple witnesses and stands as one of the most chilling statements in military history. "I know it, but Lord Raglan will have it. We have no choice but to obey." 6 words that summarized everything wrong with their command structure. I know it. Acknowledging the order was suicide, but Lord Raglan will have it. Shifting responsibility upward. We have no choice but to obey. Abdicating moral judgment in favor of procedural compliance. Cardigan said nothing for a long moment, just sat on his horse staring at the valley that would soon be filled with dead men and dying horses. Then he saluted with mechanical precision, turned his mount, and rode toward his brigade. It was 11:05 in the morning. Smith watched Cardigan approach and knew immediately something had gone wrong. You learn to read officers after 16 years in the service, learn to see past the aristocratic mask they wore, and recognize stress in the set of their shoulders, fear in the tightness around their eyes. Cardigan's face was blank, but his jaw was clenched hard enough that Smith could see the muscle jumping. The colonel reached the Light Brigade and started giving orders without dismounting, his voice carrying that parade ground clarity that made every word audible even over the ambient noise of 1,500 horses shifting and stamping. The brigade would form in 3 lines. First line, 13th Light Dragoons on the left, 17th Lancers on the right. Second line, 11th Hussars in the center. Third line, 4th Light Dragoons and 8th Hussars in support. They would advance down the valley and attack the Russian battery at the eastern end. No elaboration, no explanation of why or how or what came after. Just the objective stated as fact, as if reciting from a drill manual. Officers dispersed to their units to relay the orders. The reaction among the men was silence, the kind of heavy quiet that falls when everyone understands something terrible is about to happen, but nobody wants to be the first to say it out loud. These were professional soldiers who'd trained for years, who understood terrain and tactics, and what artillery did to cavalry caught in the open. They looked down the valley and did the same math Smith had done, arrived at the same grim conclusion. Private Thomas Molye of the 17th Lancers would later write in his memoir, "We knew it was wrong the moment we saw it. But no one said anything. What were we going to say? You couldn't refuse orders. You couldn't question your superiors in front of the formation. Military discipline was built on obedience, on the assumption that officers knew what they were doing and soldiers followed commands without debate. Except today the officers clearly didn't know, or they knew and were following orders anyway, which was somehow worse. Men started going through the small rituals that soldiers perform before battle, automatic gestures that gave hands something to do while minds tried to process what was coming. Some pulled out letters they'd written weeks earlier, tucked them deeper into jacket pockets, made sure the paper was secure so maybe someone would find them afterward and mail them home. Others scribbled hasty notes on scraps of paper, names and addresses and final messages compressed into a few lines, handed them to men in the rear ranks who had slightly better odds of surviving. Private John Penn of the 17th Lancers took off his wedding ring, pressed it into the hand of a cook who was staying behind with the supply wagons, said, "Send it to my wife if I don't come back." The cook took the ring without arguing, both of them understanding the transaction meant Penn didn't expect to need it anymore. Nobody prayed out loud. A few men crossed themselves, quick furtive gestures that might have been habit or might have been genuine appeals to whatever God watched over soldiers about to do something stupid. Most just stared down the valley with faces gone carefully blank, the expression of men who'd learned not to show fear because fear was contagious and could break a formation faster than enemy fire. Smith tightened the leather strap on his helmet, adjusted his ammunition pouch one more time even though it was already secure, checked his saber draw for the 3rd time in 5 minutes. Routine movements, muscle memory, the kind of preparation that kept your hands busy while your brain processed the fact that you were probably going to die in the next half hour. Corporal Bradley sat next to him, gripping his reins so tight his knuckles had gone white, staring at the valley with eyes that were too wide. The kid was 22, farm boy from Sussex, 3 years in the cavalry, spent mostly on garrison duty and parade drill. This was his first real action, and it was going to be a slaughter. Smith could see Bradley's hands shaking slightly, could hear his breathing getting faster and shallower, the early signs of panic that could spread through green troops, if not checked immediately. He leaned over slightly without making it obvious, kept his voice low and calm. "Bradley." The corporal's head turned toward him, but his eyes stayed fixed on the valley. "Check your girth strap," Smith said. "Make sure it's tight, but not too tight. You need room for your horse to breathe when we run." Bradley's hands moved automatically, fumbling with the leather strap under his mount's belly, checking tension he'd already verified twice. The action gave him something concrete to focus on, besides the approaching nightmare. Smith waited until Bradley's breathing had slowed slightly before continuing. "When we go in, you stay close to me. You do exactly what I do. If I gallop, you gallop. If I wheel left, you wheel left. You don't think, you just follow. Understood?" Bradley nodded without speaking, throat working like he was trying to swallow something that wouldn't go down. Smith wanted to say more, wanted to tell the kid he'd be fine, that cavalry survived worse than this all the time, but those would have been lies and Bradley deserved better than false comfort. Instead, Smith just said, "Check your ammunition, say your prayers if you have them, And when I say gallop, you gallop. At 11:08, Captain Nolan rode over to the 17th Lancers, his old regiment from years back, and attached himself to the formation without asking permission. He was still breathing hard from his confrontation with Lucan, still visibly agitated, jaw clenched and eyes bright with something that might have been anger or might have been shame. Some of the men glanced at him, curious why a staff officer was choosing to ride with the ranks instead of staying safely behind the lines where staff officers belonged. But nobody questioned it. If Nolan wanted to ride into whatever was coming, that was his business. Maybe he knew something they didn't. Maybe he just couldn't stand to watch from a distance. It didn't matter. In a few minutes, none of it would matter. Lord Cardigan positioned himself 20 yards ahead of the first line, sitting alone on his horse like he was waiting for a portrait artist. His uniform caught the late morning sun, gold braid gleaming, cherry trousers vivid against the dull brown grass. He drew his saber, the blade catching light as it cleared the scabbard. Behind him, 670 sabers hissed free in response, a sound like wind through metal leaves. Horses shifted, some whinnying softly, others standing perfectly still, waiting for the command they knew was coming. The valley stretched ahead, empty and vast and patient. Cardigan raised his saber, held it there for a moment while 670 men watched and waited. His voice when it came was calm and clipped, the same tone he used for parade inspection. The brigade will advance. Walk march. At 11:10 in the morning, the Light Brigade started moving toward the valley that would destroy them. October 25th, 1854, 11:10 in the morning. The Light Brigade began moving at a walk, 670 horses stepping forward in formation, across grass that would remember them as stains nobody could wash away. Troop Sergeant Major George Smith sat in the second line, watching the backs of men in the 13th Light Dragoons and 17th Lancers ahead, their postures rigid, sabers resting on shoulders at the regulation angle. The pace was deliberate, almost ceremonial, Cardigan keeping it slow to preserve the horse's strength for what everyone knew was coming. They had more than a mile to cover. Galloping too early meant arriving with blown mounts that couldn't maneuver or respond when the killing started in earnest. For the first 2 minutes, nothing happened except the sound of hooves on earth and the creak of leather tack. 670 horses moving as one unit. The kind of parade ground precision that looked magnificent on review and meant absolutely nothing when artillery opened up. Smith kept his eyes on the valley ahead, scanning for terrain features that might offer cover if formations broke down, memorizing distances to landmarks he could use to judge how far they traveled. The Russian guns at the far end were visible as dark shapes against the sky, too distant yet for details but close enough to confirm they were real and waiting. On the ridges to left and right, more artillery positions, crews moving around their pieces with the practiced efficiency of men who knew their trade. The valley funneled them into a killing zone so perfect it could have been designed by someone who wanted to demonstrate what happened when cavalry charged prepared positions across open ground. No trees, no buildings, no stone walls or ditches deep enough to provide meaningful cover. Just grass and air and the certainty that once the Russians decided to start shooting, there would be nowhere to hide and no way to dodge. Smith's horse, the gray gelding he'd ridden since '52, moved steadily beneath him, ears forward, alert but not spooked. The animal had been through combat before, carried him through skirmishes on the northwest frontier where bullets snapped overhead and powder smoke turned daylight into twilight. This felt different, though. The horse sensed it through Smith's tension transmitted via reins and seat, the way riders and mounts developed a language of pressure and weight that communicated fear better than words. Corporal Bradley rode to Smith's immediate right, hands still gripping reins too tight, making his bay gelding toss its head in protest at the restriction. The kid's breathing had steadied somewhat after Smith's earlier intervention, but his face had gone pale, skin stretched tight over cheekbones in the way that meant he was using every ounce of discipline to keep from bolting or vomiting or both. Smith didn't look at him directly, didn't want to draw attention to the kid's fear and make it worse, but he stayed aware of Bradley's position in his peripheral vision. Ready to grab the boy's reins if panic took over, and he tried to wheel away from the formation. Running would be a court-martial offense, assuming anyone survived to hold a trial, but more importantly, it would be abandoning your mates, leaving a gap in the line that exposed others to fire that should have been shared across the formation. You stayed because leaving meant your friends died in your place. It was the oldest contract in the military, older than flags or anthems or any of the grand abstractions officers used to justify sending men into hell. 200 yards into the advance, Smith heard the first shot from the Fedukeen Heights on their left. A single cannon firing, the sound rolling across the valley like distant thunder, followed by the whistle of a round shot passing overhead. The ball hit ground 30 yards left of the 13th Light Dragoons, threw up a geyser of dirt and grass, then kept going, bouncing and skipping across the valley floor like a stone skipped on water. It lost velocity with each bounce but stayed dangerous, capable of breaking legs or crushing ribs if it caught someone at the end of its arc. The formation didn't react, kept moving at the same measured walk, because reacting to near misses would mean spending all your energy flinching and none of it staying combat effective. The second shot hit. Smith heard the impact before he saw it, a wet thud that was different from metal hitting earth, followed by a horse's scream, and then a man's shorter yelp cut off abruptly. Private James Phillips' mount took the round shot through the chest, the iron ball punching through muscle and bone and exiting out the animal's hindquarters in a spray of blood and viscera. Phillips was thrown clear, but the ball kept going, passed through empty air where Phillips had been, and struck the rider directly behind him. Private William Dudley caught it in the shoulder, the impact tearing his arm completely off at the joint and spinning him out of the saddle like he'd been hit with a sledgehammer. Both men went down. Phillips's horse collapsed immediately, legs folding, massive body hitting ground with enough force that Smith felt the impact transmitted through earth to his own mount's hooves. The animal thrashed briefly, screaming in that high-pitched way injured horses did, then went still. Phillips lay next to his dead mount, not moving, probably killed by the fall or by his horse rolling onto him. Dudley was still alive, trying to crawl with his remaining arm, blood pumping from the severed shoulder in rhythmic spurts that meant arterial damage. He made it maybe 6 feet before strength gave out, and he collapsed face down in grass that was already turning red. The formation closed the gap automatically. Men from the 13th drifted left to fill the empty space, tightening ranks without being told, muscle memory from hundreds of drills clicking into action. Nobody looked back at Phillips or Dudley. Looking meant thinking about what you'd just seen, processing the image of a man's arm torn off by a cannonball, and thinking led to fear, and fear led to hesitation, and hesitation got you killed. Smith's hand stayed steady on his reins. His eyes stayed forward. His breathing stayed controlled. Corporal Bradley had seen it, though, turned his head at the sound of impact, watched Dudley trying to crawl with blood pouring from his shoulder, and now the kid's face had gone from pale to gray, lips pressed together so tight they disappeared. Smith's voice came out low and flat, cutting through whatever horror movie was playing in Bradley's head. Eyes front, Corporal. Watch your spacing. Keep formation. Bradley's head snapped forward, training overriding shock, and his hands adjusted reins to bring his mount back into proper alignment. The shaking in his fingers got worse, but he held position. More guns fired. The Russian artillery on the Fedukeen Heights had found their range and started working in earnest. Multiple cannons firing in sequence, so the valley filled with the rolling thunder of sustained bombardment. Round-shot, solid iron balls weighing anywhere from 6 to 12 pounds depending on the gun started falling into the formation with increasing accuracy. These weren't random pot shots anymore. These were aim volleys from crews who'd calculated distance and elevation and knew exactly where their targets were. When a round shot hit at this range, it didn't stop with the first impact. The balls bounced and skipped, each impact sending them careening forward at angles that were impossible to predict, turning every shot into multiple chances to kill. Private John Vahey of the 17th Lancers, riding in the first line maybe 30 yards ahead of Smith's position, saw the man next to him suddenly drop. Corporal Thomas Molye, a veteran of the Punjab campaign who'd survived 3 years of border fighting without a scratch, was cut in half at the waist by a cannonball that came in low and horizontal. The ball passed through Molye's torso at belt level, severing his spine and everything else in a microsecond of impact that left the top half of his body sitting in the saddle while the bottom half stayed attached to stirrups. For 3 impossible seconds, Molier's upper body remained upright, hands still gripping reins, head tilted forward like he was looking at something interesting on the ground. Then physics reasserted itself, and the corpse slid sideways out of the saddle, hit the grass in a loose tumble that left a red smear. Vahey kept riding. What else could you do? Stop and mourn, and you join him. The only direction was forward, into more of whatever had just killed Molière, because turning around meant breaking formation and abandoning everyone else to concentrated fire. The logic was insane but perfect, the kind of military mathematics that made sense only when you were inside it. Part of the calculation, one more data point in someone's after-action report about acceptable casualties. 300 yards in, and the fire from the Fatakin Heights intensified, joined now by guns on the causeway heights to their right, creating a crossfire that turned the valley into geometry problem, where the only wrong answer was being in the intersection when the lines crossed. Shells burst overhead, crude fused rounds that exploded into fragments of iron casing that sprayed downward in cones of shrapnel. The explosions weren't particularly large or impressive, just dull crumps followed by black smoke and the whisper snap of metal fragments slicing through air. When shrapnel hit flesh, it punched through like needles. Dozens of small wounds instead of one catastrophic impact. Death by 1,000 cuts delivered at supersonic velocity. Horses started falling more frequently, animals taking hits that broke legs or punctured lungs or severed major blood vessels. A horse could run for a surprising distance on a mortal wound, adrenaline and momentum carrying it forward until blood loss or organ failure caught up. Then it would stumble and go down and throw its rider or trap him underneath 1,200 pounds of dying horseflesh. Riders hit the ground hard, some managing to roll clear and scramble to their feet, others disappearing under the hooves of horses coming up behind them. The second and third lines had to navigate around fallen bodies, jump over or swerve around obstacles that hadn't been there a moment before, and every deviation from straight-line advance added seconds to the crossing time, seconds that meant more exposure to Russian guns. Troop Sergeant Major Smith felt something hot streak past his right side. So close he felt the air displacement like a fist punching past his ribs. He glanced down reflexively and saw his ammunition pouch, the leather container strapped to his right hip that held cartridges for his pistol, sliced open from top to bottom by a piece of shrapnel. The leather flapped loose, cartridges spilling out and bouncing away, lost in grass. If that fragment had hit 6 inches higher, it would have gone through his rib cage and into his lung or heart. Instead, it had cut leather. The difference between alive and dead was often that arbitrary, that random, success measured in inches and split seconds nobody controlled. Smith reached down while still riding, one-handed, and pulled the ruined pouch free from its strap before it could tangle in his saddle rigging. He let it drop, watched it tumble away behind him, then checked that his pistol was still secure in its holster on his left side. The gun was there, loaded, probably useless in a cavalry charge where sabers did the real work, but comforting in the way any weapon was comforting when you were riding into massed artillery. He glanced at Corporal Bradley again, saw the kid was still holding formation, still pale as milk but functioning, doing his job despite whatever terror was screaming in his head. At 400 yards, Cardigan increased pace to a trot. The order rippled back through the formation, officers and NCOs passing it along verbally and through example, horses shifting from walk to trot almost simultaneously. The acceleration felt good after the agonizing slowness of the walk, gave the illusion of progress, of getting this over with faster. But it also opened gaps in the lines more quickly. Men and horses fell, and the spaces took longer to close because everyone was moving faster, harder to adjust spacing when you were trotting versus walking. The neat parade ground formations started developing ragged edges, holes where troopers had gone down, clusters where men bunched together, seeking unconscious comfort in proximity. Smith's gelding moved smoothly into the faster pace. This was what the animal had trained for, responding to leg pressure and rein tension with precision that came from hundreds of hours of drill. Bradley's bay was less smooth, stumbled slightly on rough ground, recovered without throwing its rider, but the kid's face registered panic for a moment before control reasserted. The Russian gunners had adjusted their timing too, firing more rapidly now that the target was moving faster, crews working their pieces with mechanical efficiency. Load, aim, fire, swab the barrel, reload. Each gun crew could manage maybe 2 shots per minute with round shot, faster with canister once the range closed enough. 2 shots per minute times 12 guns on the Fedukine Heights alone meant 24 projectiles every 60 seconds, each one capable of killing multiple men if it hit right. The math was depressing, but Smith couldn't stop running it in his head, couldn't stop calculating odds and trajectories, because that's what NCOs did, figured out problems and found solutions, or at least figured out which problems had no solutions and needed to be endured rather than solved. This was the latter category. No solution except forward motion and hope that Russian powder was damp, or their gun crews got tired, or divine intervention put fingers on the scale. None of those seemed likely. Captain Nolan, riding with the 17th Lancers, about 30 yards ahead of Smith and slightly left, suddenly broke formation. It happened fast enough that Smith almost missed it. One moment Nolan was riding in line with his old regiment, the next he was spurring his horse forward and diagonally, cutting across the front of the entire brigade at an angle that would bring him alongside or ahead of Cardigan. His right arm was raised high, saber pointed at the sky, or maybe at the causeway heights, impossible to tell from Smith's angle and distance. Nolan's mouth was open, shouting something that was lost immediately in the artillery thunder that had become constant background noise. What was he doing? Smith's mind processed possibilities in the fraction of a second before everything went wrong. Nolan was a staff officer, aide-de-camp, who delivered the original order, so maybe he'd realized there was a mistake. Maybe he was trying to redirect them toward the actual objective on the Causeway Heights instead of the suicidal charge down the valley. That would explain the diagonal path, the arm pointing left toward the heights, the urgency in his posture. Or maybe he'd just lost his mind, caught up in the cavalry charge he'd helped set in motion, swept into the collective insanity of 670 men riding towards certain death. Madness made as much sense as anything else today. The shell that killed Nolan exploded 10 feet above his head. Smith saw the flash, saw the black smoke blossom, heard the crump of detonation that was somehow distinct from all the other artillery fire. A piece of the shell casing, jagged and spinning and still hot from the explosion, hit Nolan square in the chest. The fragment was maybe 6 inches long, irregular wedge of cast iron driven by explosive force, and it punched through Nolan's sternum and ribs like they were paper, sliced through his heart, and exited out his back between the shoulder blades. The entry wound was small, the exit wound was massive, and the amount of blood that came out was shocking even at 30 yards distance, where Smith couldn't see details clearly. Nolan's arm stayed raised, both hands still gripping his saber, the blade pointing at whatever he'd been trying to indicate. His mouth opened wider, and a sound came out that wasn't human, wasn't any noise Smith had heard a person make before. It was high-pitched and gurgling, air being forced through a destroyed chest cavity, blood-filling lungs, vocal cords trying to produce sound with equipment that no longer worked properly. The scream went on for maybe 3 seconds that felt eternal, a sound that made Smith's skin crawl despite everything else happening around them, despite the artillery fire and the men dying and the horses collapsing. That sound was worse somehow, was the noise death made when it caught you by surprise in the middle of trying to fix your mistake. Nolan's horse, completely untouched by the shell that had killed its rider, kept galloping. The animal had been trained to respond to pressure and commands, and right now pressure and momentum said, "Keep running," so it did. Nolan's body remained upright in the saddle, spine stiff, arms still raised with the saber pointing skyward, blood pouring down his front and soaking his uniform until the blue wool turned black. His face was locked in whatever expression he'd had when the fragment hit, mouth open mid-shout, eyes wide but already emptying of whatever made eyes look alive, versus just being wet orbs in a skull. The horse carried its dead rider back through the advancing lines of the 11th Hussars, passing within 10 feet of Smith's position. Smith got a clear view as the corpse went by. Nolan's chest was caved in where the fragment had entered, ribs visible through shredded uniform, blood and tissue hanging out of the exit wound on his back. The gurgling scream had stopped, but Nolan's mouth stayed open, frozen in death's mockery of speech. His eyes were open too, staring at nothing or everything, impossible to tell. The horse kept running, carrying the body back through second and third lines, men watching in horrified silence as their staff officer rode past as a corpse, until finally Nolan's body lost whatever balance had kept it upright and slid sideways out of the saddle. It hit the ground in a loose tumble that left limbs at wrong angles, rolled twice, came to rest face down in grass. The Light Brigade kept advancing. Nobody stopped for Nolan. Nobody could stop. Stopping meant dying in place while the rest of the formation rode away from you. The only safety in safety was a relative term measured in slightly lower probability of immediate death, was in the formation, was in the mass of horses and men moving forward together. Smith's mind cataloged what he'd seen, filed it away in the mental folder labeled things to process later, if there is a later, and refocused on the immediate task of keeping his horse moving and his section together. Corporal Bradley had watched Nolan die, turned to track the horse carrying the corpse through their line, and his face had gone beyond pale into something that looked like shock. The kid's lips were moving, but no sound came out. Hands frozen on reins, body rigid. Smith's voice cut through like a blade. "Corporal Bradley, on me, eyes forward, check your horse." It wasn't gentle, but gentle wouldn't penetrate the fog of shock that was descending over Bradley's ability to function. The words needed to be sharp enough to slice through horror and reconnect the kid to training, to the automatic responses drilled into cavalry troopers until they could execute under any conditions. Bradley's head snapped around, met Smith's eyes for a half second, then jerked forward to look at the valley ahead. His hands moved on the reins, adjusting pressure, bringing his bay back into proper spacing with the formation. The shaking got worse, but he held position. 600 yards from the Russian battery at the valley's end, the guns positioned there opened fire for the first time. Up until now, the Light Brigade had been taking fire from the flanks, from the Fedukine and Causeway Heights to left and right. Artillery that was deadly, but firing at angles that required leading the target and calculating traverse. The battery at the valley's end had the easiest shot in the world, straight down the throat of a cavalry charge coming directly at them. No complicated math required, just aim at the mass of horses and men and pull the lanyard. 12 cannon firing in near unison. The sound was like standing inside thunder, and the smoke from their muzzles rolled forward in a gray-white wall that momentarily obscured everything downrange. But Smith didn't need to see the effects to know what was happening. He'd studied artillery, read the manuals, talked to gunners about their craft during long campaign winters when everyone shared knowledge to pass time. At 600 yards, Russian guns would be firing round shots still, solid balls that had the range and accuracy to hit reliably. Later, when the Light Brigade got closer, they'd switch to canister, the anti-personnel rounds that turned cannons into giant shotguns. But right now it was just physics, iron balls weighing 12 pounds launched at 1,200 feet per second, enough kinetic energy to punch through anything biological and keep going. The first volley from the end battery hit the formation like a giant's fist. Smith heard impacts, saw horses in the first line suddenly dropping, saw riders thrown or crushed. The 17th Lancers, riding on the right side of the first line, took casualties that Smith couldn't count from his position, but could estimate from the gaps that opened suddenly in their formation. Lieutenant Maxey, who'd been riding at the front of the 17th, took 3 balls to the chest almost simultaneously, multiple guns firing at the same target by pure chance. Maxey's torso came apart, literally disintegrated, and what was left fell off the horse in pieces too small to identify from a distance. The second discharge from the end battery was timed to hit, while the Light Brigade was still reacting to the first. Russian gun crews working with practiced efficiency that spoke to years of training and experience. This time the pattern of fire walked left, hit the 13th Light Dragoons on the other side of the first line, tore through their formation with brutal effect. 15 men went down in the space of maybe 3 seconds, horses collapsing mid-stride, throwing riders who hit the ground and stayed down or got trampled by the ranks coming up behind. Private John Lee's horse took a ball through the neck, the impact severing the carotid artery and jugular vein simultaneously. Blood sprayed in a crimson fountain that painted Lee and his mount and the grass around them red. The horse reared, screaming, a sound that was somehow worse than artillery thunder because it was biological, a living thing experiencing agony, then toppled sideways. Lee tried to kick free of stirrups, but wasn't fast enough. The horse landed on his left leg, 1,200 pounds of dying animal pinning him to the ground. Lee screamed once, high and thin, then the scream cut off as shock or pain took him somewhere beyond vocalization. He could see the rest of the 13th riding past him, leaving him behind because what else could they do? Stop the entire advance to help one trapped man. His face turned to watch them go, eyes wide, mouth working, hand reaching out like he could grab someone's stirrup and pull himself free. Then the second line rode over him, horses jumping or swerving around the obstacle of Lee's pinned body, and Smith lost sight of him in the dust and confusion. Lord Cardigan, still riding 20 yards ahead of everyone else, increased pace to a canter. The order rippled back through what remained of the formation, though calling it a formation now was generous. The neat lines from 1110 had dissolved into something more organic, clusters of men riding together because they happened to be near each other, gaps where entire troops had been wiped out, ragged edges where the wounded tried to keep up with their mounts laboring under them. Smith spurred his gelding into canter, felt the animal respond immediately despite the stress and fear it had to be feeling, sensed Corporal Bradley doing the same to his right. The Russian guns were reloading. At this range, they could manage maybe 2 shots per minute, which meant the Light Brigade had maybe 30 seconds before the next volley, 30 seconds to close another 100 yards and reduce the time the gunners had to kill them. Except the flanking fire from the heights hadn't stopped. Shells continued to burst overhead, round shot continued to bounce through the formation, and men continued to fall at a rate that Smith's mind was having trouble processing. His training said to stay focused on your immediate surroundings, your section, your squad, the men you're directly responsible for. But peripheral vision kept showing him casualties piling up faster than seemed possible. The 13th Light Dragoons, which had started with 145 men, was down to maybe 30 still mounted and combat effective. The 17th Lancers had lost over half their strength. The 11th Hussars, Smith's own regiment, had gaps in every troop. Empty saddles where veterans he'd known for years were now corpses cooling in the grass. Captain William Morris of the 17th Lancers took a shell fragment in his right arm, the impact spinning him halfway out of the saddle. Smith saw him grab his horse's mane with his left hand, the only hand that still worked, and haul himself back upright through sheer strength and refusal to fall. Morris's right arm hung useless, blood soaking his sleeve and dripping off his fingertips. But he was still in the saddle, still riding toward the Russian guns because stopping meant dying, and dying meant letting down the men who were still alive and might need him. Leadership wasn't about speeches or inspiration. It was about refusing to quit when your body was screaming at you to lie down and make the pain stop. The ground under the Light Brigade's hooves was no longer just grass. They were riding over their own dead now, over bodies and pieces of bodies, over wounded men trying to crawl to safety that didn't exist, over the carcasses of horses that had carried soldiers faithfully right up until the moment a cannonball ended them. Smith's gelding jumped over a corpse, came down clean on the other side, kept moving. The animal's training was holding, its conditioning pushing it forward despite every instinct that said run away from the noise and blood and death. Horses were prey animals, evolved to flee from danger, but centuries of breeding and training had created mounts that would charge into hell if their riders asked. It was both magnificent and obscene. Corporal Bradley's horse stumbled, right front leg buckling, and for a horrible second, Smith thought they were going down, thought he'd have to decide whether to stop and try to help or keep riding and leave the kid to whatever came next. But the horse recovered. Whatever had caused the stumble wasn't catastrophic damage, and Bradley stayed in the saddle through balance or luck or both. His face had gone beyond fear into something that looked like resignation. The expression of someone who'd accepted they were going to die and was just waiting to find out how. Smith wanted to say something, offer some reassurance or encouragement, but words felt pointless. What could you say that mattered when artillery was tearing men apart 3 feet to your left? At 500 yards, the Russian battery switched ammunition. Smith didn't see them reload, but he knew from the sound of the next volley, knew from the sudden exponential increase in casualties in the first line ahead of him. Canister shot, the anti-personnel rounds that Russian gunners had been saving until the Light Brigade got close enough that the spread pattern would be maximally effective. Each canister round was a thin metal cylinder packed with 85 iron balls. When fired, the cylinder disintegrated and the balls spread in a cone, turning the cannon into a giant shotgun that threw shrapnel in a pattern maybe 30 feet wide at this range. 12 guns firing canisters simultaneously meant over 1,000 iron balls flying through the air in overlapping cones of death. The first canister volley hit the center of the 17th Lancers and deleted 15 men from existence. That was the only word for it that made sense to Smith's mind as he watched from 30 yards back. One moment there were riders in formation, the next moment there was empty space and bodies falling and horses collapsing in heaps. The sound was different from round shot, not the solid thump of iron ball hitting flesh, but a hissing whisper snap of multiple projectiles cutting through air and then through meat and bone. Men didn't just fall, they came apart, bodies perforated by dozens of impacts that turned torsos into sieves and severed limbs and opened arteries. The second canister discharge walked left and shredded the flank of the 13th Light Dragoons. Private John Lee, who'd been trapped under his dead horse and left behind, was already out of the fight, but his squad mates weren't so lucky. The canister balls hit them in a concentrated burst that killed outright or wounded so severely that death would follow in minutes. Horses screamed and thrashed, some trying to run with legs that no longer worked properly, others collapsing immediately as balls punched through their lungs or hearts or spines. Riders were thrown or crushed, adding to the growing carpet of casualties the following lines had to navigate around. Lord George Paget, commanding the 4th Light Dragoons in the third line behind Smith's position, would later describe this moment in his memoir. I saw men and horses drop like ninepins. The ground was strewn with bodies. It seemed impossible that anyone could ride through such fire and survive. Paget was watching the destruction from maybe 50 yards back, far enough to see the big picture, close enough to know he was riding into the same meat grinder that had just eviscerated the first line. But he kept his regiment moving forward because orders were orders, and stopping would just mean dying in a different location with the same end result. Private Whiteman of the 17th Lancers, riding somewhere ahead of Smith in what remained of the first line, felt his horse shudder violently beneath him. The animal had been hit. Whiteman didn't know where or how badly, but it kept running despite whatever damage had been done. Blood was streaming down the horse's flank, leaving a red trail in the grass, soaking into Whiteman's trousers where his legs gripped the saddle. The horse's breathing had changed, was coming in labored gasps that meant lung damage or blood loss or both. But the animal's legs kept churning, kept carrying Whiteman forward, because that's what it had been trained to do. Run until it couldn't run anymore. Whiteman leaned forward over the horse's neck, making himself a smaller target, urging the dying animal to give him just a little more, just enough to reach the Russian guns, just enough to matter. His hands were sticky with blood that might have been his or the horse's, impossible to tell. Everything was red now, his uniform soaked, his face spattered, his vision starting to narrow at the edges from blood loss or shock. If he could just reach the guns, if he could just get close enough to swing his saber, then dying would mean something instead of being random casualty number 137 in a catalog of failure. At 400 yards, the Russian guns fired again, canister rounds with tighter spread patterns now that the range had closed, more concentrated, more lethal. The effect was catastrophic. Entire sections of the formation simply ceased to exist. Men and horses turned into red mist and tumbling bodies. Sergeant Talbot of the 11th Hussars, riding in Smith's line maybe 20 yards to the left, saw the entire front rank of his troop disappear in the space of a heartbeat. One moment there were 8 riders ahead of him, veterans he'd trained with and drunk with and trusted with his life. The next moment there was nothing but riderless horses and bodies on the ground and empty air where living men had been. Talbot kept riding. What else was there? Stop and mourn and you join them. The only direction was forward, into more of whatever had just killed them, because turning around meant breaking formation and exposing everyone else to concentrated fire. The logic was insane but inescapable. Captain Morris of the 17th Lancers, His right arm, still hanging useless and streaming blood, took a second hit. Shrapnel from a shell burst caught him in the side, punctured his ribs, drove fragments of metal into tissue that didn't have enough blood left to bleed properly. The impact nearly knocked him off his horse, but he grabbed mane with his functioning left hand and stayed mounted through willpower that defied biological limits. His face was gray, lips pressed together in a thin line, eyes locked on the Russian guns ahead, because looking anywhere else would mean acknowledging pain, and acknowledging pain would mean surrendering to it. The 13th Light Dragoons, which had started the charge with 145 men, was down to fewer than 30 still mounted and able to fight. The 17th Lancers had lost more than half their strength, maybe 60 men left out of 130. The 11th Hussars had been shattered, gaps in every troop, entire sections gone. But the survivors kept coming because stopping meant dying alone while your friends rode away from you. And cavalry doctrine said you stayed with your unit because that's where survival odds were highest, even when survival odds were approaching zero. Smith's section had taken casualties too. The man riding 3 horses to his left was gone. Smith hadn't seen him fall, but there was an empty space where Private Harrison had been, the cocky kid from Yorkshire who rode like he'd been born in the saddle. Another man, 2 positions back, was slumped in his saddle with blood running from under his helmet. Still in formation, but clearly unconscious or dead, and only staying mounted through luck and muscle memory. Corporal Bradley was still there, still pale as death but functional, his bay horse laboring but moving, one of the survivors against odds that didn't favor survival. At 300 yards, Lord Cardigan gave the order that every remaining trooper had been waiting for. Gallop. The word rippled back through what was left of the formation, though the formation had ceased to exist as anything recognizable. Just clusters of desperate men on exhausted horses driving toward the Russian guns, because there was nowhere else to go. Smith's gelding responded immediately to his leg pressure, lunged into full gallop despite the stress and exhaustion and fear, gave everything it had left because its rider was asking. This was the final sprint, the last mad dash to close distance before the next canister volley killed them all. If they could just reach the guns, if they could just get close enough that the Russian crews couldn't reload, then maybe some of them would survive long enough to matter. The Russian artillery fired one more time. At 200 yards, canister shot was lethal to everything in its cone of fire. 85 iron balls per gun, 12 guns firing, over 1,000 projectiles filling the air in overlapping patterns of death. Men were torn apart, literally shredded. Bodies opened up in ways that made Smith's stomach clench, even though he'd seen combat before, seen men die in various ways. This was different. This was industrial-scale killing, mechanical efficiency applied to the destruction of human beings, artillery doctrine executed perfectly by crews who knew their trade and didn't care about the men they were killing. Horses fell in heaps, some killed instantly, others wounded and thrashing and screaming that high-pitched sound that horses made when they were in agony. Riders who managed to jump clear were trampled by horses coming up behind them or cut down by the next canister volley or simply fell and didn't get up because shock or blood loss or sheer exhaustion had used up whatever reserves kept men functioning in combat. The noise was overwhelming, artillery thunder and explosions, and men screaming and horses screaming and officers shouting orders nobody could hear over the cacophony. Corporal Moley of the 4th Light Dragoons, riding in the 3rd line behind Smith, felt something hit his helmet with enough force to snap his head sideways. The impact rang his skull like a bell, made his vision go white for a moment, but he stayed in the saddle through instinct and training. Later, if there was a later, he'd find a dent in the brass where a canister ball had glanced off instead of punching through. The difference between alive and dead was the angle of impact, maybe 5 degrees of trajectory, physics and probability, combining in ways nobody controlled. At 100 yards, the Russian gunners didn't have time to reload. The British cavalry was on top of them, maybe 195 men out of the 670 who'd started the charge. Less than 30% survival rate over 1.25 miles of open ground. 195 riders crashing into prepared artillery positions at full gallop, sabers raised, horses blown but still running on adrenaline and fear. Men who'd ridden through hell and were now going to make someone pay for it. The impact of cavalry hitting infantry is difficult to describe if you've never seen it. It's not like battles in paintings where everything is frozen and dramatic and clean. It's chaos and violence and confusion and terror compressed into seconds where nobody knows what's happening except that they're trying to kill whoever's in front of them before that person kills them. Lord Cardigan reached the Russian guns first because he'd been riding 20 yards ahead of everyone else the entire charge, maintained that distance through luck or divine protection or simple probability catching up to him later. He rode straight through the battery with his saber raised, cut down a Russian gunner who was trying to swing a ramrod at him like a club. Cardigan's blade hit the man's shoulder, bit deep into muscle and collarbone. The Russian dropped his improvised weapon and fell. Then Cardigan kept riding, didn't stop to rally the men behind him, didn't turn to organize an assault on the battery positions, didn't do anything except ride clear through to the other side and keep going, alone, into open ground beyond the Russian lines. His duty, as he understood it based on 30 years of purchased commissions and parade ground mentality, was to lead the charge. He'd led it. He'd reached the objective. That was enough. What happened next was someone else's responsibility. Behind him, 194 surviving members of the Light Brigade crashed into the Russian gun line and discovered that artillery crews weren't just technicians who ran away when cavalry appeared. These were line infantry assigned to artillery duty, trained soldiers equipped with bayonets and swords and pistols who'd watched the British ride through sustained fire to reach them and were now ready to make the Light Brigade pay for every foot of ground. The battery wasn't a single line of guns sitting undefended in open ground. It was a prepared defensive position with infantry support, ammunition limbers positioned behind the guns for cover, and Russian soldiers who'd been watching the Light Brigade's approach for the last 6 minutes with a mixture of disbelief and professional appreciation for courage that bordered on insanity. When 194 British cavalrymen crashed into their position at full gallop, the Russian response was immediate and coordinated, the kind of defense you got from troops who knew their job and weren't about to surrender artillery pieces without making the enemy bleed for them. Private John Vahey of the 17th Lancers, who'd watched Corporal Mollier get cut in half earlier in the charge, drove his lance through a Russian gunner's chest with enough force that the steel point punched through the man's sternum and emerged from his back between the shoulder blades. The gunner's eyes went wide, mouth opening in shock or pain or both, hands grabbing at the lance shaft like he could somehow pull it back out and reverse what had just happened. Vahey tried to withdraw the weapon, needed it free for the next engagement, but the lance was stuck, caught on bone, or lodged in the gunner's spine. He pulled harder, jerking the shaft, and the Russian's body lifted slightly off the ground before the lance finally tore free in a spray of blood that painted Vahey's uniform front and face. A second Russian came at Vahey from the side, bayonet fixed on a musket, the blade catching morning sun as it swept toward Vahey's ribs. Vahey let go of his lance. The weapon was useless now, fouled with blood and tissue, and drew his saber in a motion so fast it was almost reflexive. Muscle memory from 10,000 practice draws on the parade ground. The saber came free of its scabbard and Vahey slashed wildly. No technique, no form, just raw desperation translated into steel cutting air and then cutting flesh. The blade caught the Russian across the face, opened his cheek from eye socket to jaw, teeth visible through the gash. The Russian went down, both hands clutching his ruined face, blood pouring between his fingers. Vahey's horse, which had carried him through the entire charge despite taking multiple hits, finally gave out. The animal had been running on adrenaline and training, and whatever mysterious reserves kept dying horses moving when logic said they should collapse. But those reserves were exhausted now. The horse's front legs buckled, knees hitting ground first, then the rest of the animal folded, going down in stages that gave Vahey just enough time to kick free of stirrups and throw himself clear before 1,200 pounds of horseflesh crashed onto the spot where he'd been sitting. He hit the ground hard, shoulder taking the impact, rolled twice, came up with his saber still gripped in his right hand, because dropping your weapon meant dying unarmed. A Russian officer, distinguishable by better uniform and a pistol instead of a musket, fired at Vahey from maybe 10 feet away. The range was point blank, impossible to miss. Except the officer was moving and Vahey was moving, and the pistol ball went wide by inches, close enough that Vehe heard it snap past his ear. The officer was trying to reload, fumbling with powder and ball, hands shaking from stress or fear, and Vehe didn't give him time to finish. He lunged forward, closing distance in 3 running steps, and drove his saber into the officer's stomach just below the ribcage. The blade went in at an upward angle, punctured liver or kidney or both, slid between ribs, found something vital. The officer's mouth opened in a gasp that might have been the start of a scream, but Vehe ripped the saber free, and the officer collapsed, hands pressed to his gut, trying to hold in intestines that were already spilling out. Lieutenant Alexander Dunn of the 11th Hussars, 23 years old, tall and broad-shouldered and built like someone who'd spent his life doing physical labor instead of sitting in drawing rooms, saw Sergeant Bentley go down. Bentley's horse had been shot from under him, the animal collapsing mid-stride and throwing its rider hard enough that Bentley lost his saber in the fall. He scrambled to his feet, dazed, blood running from a cut on his forehead, and found himself facing a Russian infantryman with a bayonet who was moving in for the kill. Bentley had no weapon, no defense, was about to die in the next 2 seconds unless someone intervened. Dunn spurred his horse toward the Russian, leaning out of the saddle at an angle that would have gotten him killed if anyone had been paying attention to him instead of Bentley, and swung his saber in a downward arc that used the horse's momentum and Dunn's body weight and gravity to deliver maximum force. The blade took the Russian's arm off at the elbow, severed it cleanly through bone and muscle and tendon, the forearm and hand still gripping the musket flying away in a spray of blood. The Russian stared at the stump of his arm for a half-second of shock before pain and blood loss registered. Then he fell. Dunn didn't wait to see if the man was dead, had already turned his horse and was reaching down to grab Bentley's collar. The sergeant was heavy, dead weight plus armor and equipment, but Dunn hauled him up behind the saddle through strength that shouldn't have been possible, got Bentley's arms around his waist, and spurred away from the immediate fighting. They made it back toward British lines, Dunn's horse laboring under double weight but still moving, still functional. Both men would survive. Dunn would later receive the Victoria Cross for that action, one of the few decorations awarded from a battle where the primary accomplishment was not dying. Corporal Moley of the 4th Light Dragoons reached one of the captured Russian cannons and did what cavalry doctrine said you did when you captured enemy artillery. He dismounted, grabbed his saber by the blade despite the fact that it would cut his hand, positioned the point at the touch hole, the small vent at the breech where the powder charge was ignited, and jammed the weapon in with both hands. The saber point went into the touch hole maybe 3 inches, wedged tight, the blade bent slightly from the force but held. The gun was spiked, temporarily disabled. Would need significant work to remove the saber and return the piece to service. It was a small victory, meaningless in the larger context of the charge's failure, but it was something, a tiny piece of damage inflicted on the enemy who'd killed so many. A Russian gunner grabbed Moley from behind, wrapped arms around his chest in a bear hug that pinned his arms to his sides, started trying to drag him away from the gun and toward Russian lines where prisoners were being collected or executed depending on mood and circumstances. Moley kicked backward, felt his heel connect with the gunner's shin hard enough to make the man's grip loosen slightly. That was enough. Moley twisted, broke free, spun to face his attacker. The Russian was reaching for a knife at his belt. Moley pulled his pistol from its holster on his hip. The weapon had been loaded since the start of the charge but never fired because cavalry didn't shoot artillery crews. They cut them down with sabers. He fired point blank into the Russian's chest, saw the man's tunic fabric dimple inward where the ball struck, saw the exit wound bloom red on his back. The Russian fell. Moley looked around for his horse, couldn't find it in the chaos of men and animals and smoke, grabbed the reins of a riderless mount that was trotting past with an empty saddle and blood-soaked tack. The horse was British, one of the Light Brigade's mounts whose rider was dead or captured or lying somewhere in the valley. Moley swung up into the saddle, ignored the sticky blood that covered the leather, and spurred toward where he thought British lines were. Direction sense completely scrambled by the fighting and smoke and disorientation. Sergeant Major Smith had made it through the charge with Corporal Bradley still riding next to him, both men and both horses intact through probability that defied calculation. They crashed into the Russian battery positions along with what remained of the 11th Hussars. Maybe 30 men out of 110 who'd started found themselves in the middle of close quarters fighting that was nothing like the cavalry charges Smith had experienced in India. This wasn't open ground with room to maneuver and reform. This was confined space between gun carriages and ammunition limbers, where horses couldn't turn properly, and sabers were almost too long to be useful, and everyone was trying to kill everyone else in a space the size of a village square. Smith's gelding, the gray he'd ridden since '52, took a bayonet thrust to the neck from a Russian infantryman who emerged from behind a gun carriage. The blade went in deep, severed the carotid artery. Blood sprayed in a fountain that covered Smith and his uniform in the ground. The horse screamed, that high, terrible sound, reared up with Smith still in the saddle, came down hard, stumbled, and started to collapse. Smith had maybe 2 seconds to react. He kicked free of stirrups, threw his weight sideways away from the falling animal, hit the ground rolling, came up on his feet with his saber still in his hand, because dropping your weapon was suicide. The Russian who'd bayoneted his horse was pulling the blade free for another thrust, this one aimed at Smith's chest. Smith sidestepped. The bayonet point passed 6 inches from his ribs, and he brought his saber down on the Russian's head in an overhand cut that split the man's skull from crown to eyebrow. The Russian dropped, nerves still firing, legs twitching, but already dead from massive brain trauma. Smith pulled his saber free. The blade came out covered in blood and brain matter and bone fragments. Looked around for another horse because being dismounted in a cavalry action meant you were vulnerable to anyone mounted who wanted to ride you down. 3 Russian infantry were moving toward him in a coordinated group, muskets with bayonets fixed, advancing in the loose formation infantry used when they outnumbered a single opponent and wanted to surround him. Smith backed toward one of the captured cannons, got his back against the gun carriage so they couldn't come at him from behind, held his saber in a guard position that would let him parry whichever thrust came first. The Russians were shouting something in their language, probably telling him to surrender, but Smith didn't speak Russian and wouldn't have surrendered anyway. British NCOs didn't surrender to infantry. It would have been embarrassing even if it hadn't also meant probable execution. One of the Russians lunged, bayonet aiming for Smith's midsection. Smith parried, blade meeting bayonet with a metallic clang, deflected the thrust to his left, stepped inside the Russian's reach, and slashed across the man's throat. The blade opened the carotid and jugular. Blood sprayed. The Russian dropped his musket and grabbed his neck with both hands, trying to stop the bleeding, but arterial damage didn't stop. You just bled out and died, and that's what the Russian did, falling to his knees and then face first into the dirt. The other 2 Russians backed off, reconsidering their odds. A riderless horse, one of the Light Brigade's mounts, trotted past Smith's position. He grabbed the reins with his free hand, hauled himself into the saddle using strength that came from desperation and 16 years of practice mounting quickly. The horse's previous rider was gone, but the saddle rigging was intact, stirrups at the right length for someone Smith's height. He settled into the saddle, got his feet into stirrups, wheeled the horse to face the 2 remaining Russians, who were now backing away from a mounted opponent they couldn't easily reach. Smith didn't pursue them, had no interest in fighting when he could be getting out of this death trap. Corporal Bradley was still alive, still mounted, his bay horse laboring but functional. The kid's face was beyond pale now, had a gray cast that meant shock or blood loss or both. His right arm hung at an odd angle, probably dislocated shoulder from impact or fall, and blood was running down his side from wounds Smith couldn't see clearly in the chaos. But Bradley was conscious, eyes tracking, still holding reins with his left hand. Smith spurred over to him, grabbed Bradley's good arm. "We're leaving. Stay with me. Don't fall behind." Bradley nodded, couldn't speak, saved his breath for staying upright in the saddle. The fighting at the battery was already devolving from organized assault into desperate melee, into chaotic retreat as the surviving Light Brigade troopers realized there was nothing to hold. No objective to secure, nowhere to go except back the way they'd come. Lord George Paget, commanding the reserves, was shouting orders that maybe half his remaining men could hear. 3's about, retire. The command to turn around and withdraw, execute retreat in some semblance of order, instead of just running away in panic. Men who heard him started wheeling their horses, forming into small groups of 3 or 4 riders, beginning the long ride back through the same killing ground they just crossed. The Russian cavalry that had been positioned on the flanks, waiting for this exact moment, charged down from the heights to cut off the British retreat. Cossacks and hussars, maybe 400 lancers in dark green uniforms, swept toward the British survivors like wolves cutting into a wounded herd. Their objective was simple: kill or capture as many British cavalry as possible before they reached their own lines. The Light Brigade's retreat turned into a running fight, isolated groups of British troopers being pursued by larger groups of Russian cavalry, lances against sabers, exhausted horses against fresh mounts. Lieutenant Percy Smith of the 13th Light Dragoons was riding alongside Cornet Cleveland when a Russian lancer caught up to them. The Cossacks' lance point drove into Cleveland's horse's hindquarters, punched through muscle and into the animal's pelvis. The horse's rear legs gave out instantly, the front legs kept moving for a stride, and then the entire animal went down in a cartwheel that threw Cleveland 20 feet forward. He hit the ground head first, neck snapping on impact, dead before he finished rolling. Lieutenant Smith kept riding, couldn't stop. The Russian lancer was already pulling his weapon free and looking for the next target. Private Farquhar of the 4th Light Dragoons, his horse completely blown and barely walking, saw Russian cavalry converging on his position from 2 directions. He dismounted because the horse was done, couldn't run anymore, would just get him killed slower. He drew his saber, positioned himself in the open, prepared to fight on foot because that's what you did when there were no good options left. A Russian lancer rode him down, the horse's chest hitting Farquhar and knocking him sprawling, the lance point following through and catching him as he fell. The blade went through Farquhar's chest, entered just below the sternum, and angled upward into his heart, lifted him slightly off the ground with the force of the mounted charge behind it. The lancer pulled his weapon free with a twist that widened the wound, and Farquhar was dead before his body hit the earth. But then something unexpected interrupted the slaughter. On the Fedukhin Heights, the Russian artillery positions that had been pounding the Light Brigade for the last 25 minutes suddenly came under attack from an entirely different direction. The French 4th Chasseurs d'Afrique, African light cavalry under General Morris, had been positioned on the western ridge, watching the British charge with growing horror. They'd received no orders to intervene, were supposed to stay in position and guard the flank. But their commander made a decision that doctrine and orders hadn't authorized. He wasn't going to sit there and watch Allied cavalry get massacred without doing something. Morris ordered a charge on the Russian gun positions. 300 French cavalry, mounted on desert-bred horses that were smaller and faster than British heavy mounts, rode up the Fedukhin Heights at an angle that brought them into the Russian artillery positions from the flank. It was aggressive, audacious, exactly the kind of decision Cardigan should have made earlier and hadn't. The Russian gunners, who'd been focusing on the valley floor, and the retreating British cavalry suddenly had French cavalry among their positions, sabers cutting down crew members, horses trampling ammunition supplies, chaos replacing the methodical firing patterns they'd maintained all morning. The Russian guns on the Fedukhin Heights went silent. Not destroyed, not captured, just temporarily disrupted by a force they hadn't expected coming from a direction they hadn't prepared for. That silence meant the Light Brigade survivors riding back through the valley were taking fire from only 2 directions instead of 3, the Causeway Heights to their right and the battery at the valley's end behind them, but not from the left flank anymore. It was a small mercy, a slight improvement in survival odds that went from nearly 0 to marginally better. But when you were riding through artillery fire on an exhausted horse, those marginal improvements meant dozens of lives saved. Private Whiteman of the 17th Lancers, riding a horse that had been dying for the last quarter mile, finally felt his mount give out completely. The animal's front legs folded, knees hitting ground, then the whole body collapsed sideways. Whiteman jumped clear just before the horse fell, landed hard on his side, rolled away from the thrashing hooves. His horse was down, flanks heaving in labored gasps, blood coming from its nose and mouth, eyes rolling white with pain or fear. Whiteman got to his feet, looked toward where he thought British lines were, couldn't see them clearly through the smoke and dust and distance. He started running on foot, still wearing spurs that caught in the long grass and tripped him after 20 yards. He went down hard, face planting into dirt, spurs tangled in vegetation. He reached down, tried to unbuckle the spurs with hands that were shaking from exhaustion and adrenaline crash, finally got them loose and kicked them away. He stood up, started running again, stumbling because his legs weren't working right, fatigue and stress and possibly wounds he hadn't registered making coordination difficult. A riderless horse trotted past him, one of the Light Brigade's mounts, saddle empty and bloody, but rigging intact. Whiteman grabbed for the reins, missed on the first try, grabbed again and caught them. He hauled himself up into the saddle using strength he shouldn't have had left, got his feet into stirrups that were slippery with someone else's blood, and rode the last 200 yards to British lines mounted instead of on foot like some infantry conscript. Sergeant Major Smith, riding a horse he'd acquired at the battery and leading Corporal Bradley, whose injuries were getting worse by the minute, heard artillery fire behind them as the Russian battery at the valley's end tried to hit retreating British cavalry. The range was long now, over 1,000 yards and increasing, but Russian gunners were still firing, because why not? The ammunition was already prepared, and the targets were still visible. Round shot bounced through the grass around Smith's position. The balls had lost most of their velocity over that distance, but were still deadly if they scored direct hits. Smith kept his horse moving at a steady canter, not galloping because the animal didn't have gallop left in it, just maintaining forward progress toward British lines that were now visible as a dark line of infantry and cavalry positioned at the western mouth of the valley. Bradley was slumping in his saddle, barely conscious, held upright only by instinct and the fact that his left hand was still gripping his reins even though his eyes were half closed. Smith moved his horse closer to Bradley's, reached across the gap between them, grabbed Bradley's uniform jacket to hold him steady. If the kid fell now, this close to safety, Smith would never forgive himself. Captain Morris of the 17th Lancers, riding with one useless arm and shrapnel wounds in his side, passed a dismounted British soldier who was being surrounded by Russian cavalry. The soldier's horse was dead, lying in a heap 30 feet away, and he was trying to fight off 3 Cossacks with just a saber while they circled him on horseback, taking turns making runs at him with their lances. Morris didn't have the strength left to help. His horse was nearly finished, and he could barely stay mounted himself, but he couldn't just ride past and leave the man to die. Except he did, because stopping would mean both of them died instead of just one, and the arithmetic of survival was brutal but clear. Sergeant Berryman, riding 50 yards behind Morris, did stop. He saw the same scene, the dismounted soldier surrounded by Russians, made a different calculation about acceptable risk. Berryman wheeled his horse, charged into the Russians from the side, scattered them temporarily through aggression and surprise. He leaned down from his saddle, grabbed the dismounted soldier by his collar, hauled him up behind the saddle in a move that took strength and timing and luck. Russian sabers slashed at Berryman's back. One blow caught him across the shoulders, but the blade glanced off the thick leather of his uniform jacket instead of biting into flesh. Berryman spurred away, carrying the soldier double, his horse straining under the extra weight, but still moving because the animal had reserves left that Berryman had been conserving during the charge by hanging back in the third line. Both men made it to British lines. The rescued soldier's name was never recorded in official reports, just listed as one of the survivors. But Berryman would receive the Victoria Cross for that action, one of 11 awarded from the charge of the Light Brigade. Recognition that saving one life in the middle of mass death was worth honoring even when the larger action was a catastrophic failure. By 11:50 in the morning, 40 minutes after the charge began, the last survivors were straggling back to British lines. They rode through positions held by the Heavy Brigade, infantry units that had moved up during the fighting, French cavalry that had taken position on the left flank. The men who returned were riding horses that were blown, lathered, bleeding, some barely able to walk. The riders weren't much better. Blood-soaked uniforms, wounds ranging from minor cuts to catastrophic trauma that should have killed them already but hadn't, because shock and adrenaline were keeping them functional temporarily. Some dismounted and collapsed immediately, legs giving out the moment they were no longer needed to grip a saddle. Others sat on their horses staring at nothing, unable to process what had just happened. brains shutting down non-essential functions to deal with trauma. Behind them, the valley was carpeted with bodies. The precise count would take days to compile, officers and NCOs walking the battlefield after a ceasefire was arranged, identifying dead men and dead horses, separating British casualties from Russian, recording names and regiments. But preliminary estimates were already circulating among the survivors. 600 to 70 men had started the charge. Maybe 350 had returned to British lines. And of those, at least 100 were wounded badly enough they'd never serve again. 278 total casualties, killed or wounded or captured. 41% casualty rate measured in men, 71% measured in horses because horses didn't surrender. They just died or got destroyed when their injuries made them non-functional. Lord Cardigan had returned first, riding back through the valley at a controlled canter like he was coming back from reconnaissance patrol instead of a suicidal charge into prepared artillery. His uniform was still immaculate, not a scratch on him, horse barely winded. When he reached British lines, he dismounted, handed his reins to an orderly, and asked a nearby officer in a conversational tone where he might find Lord Lucan. The officer, who just watched the Light Brigade get destroyed, stared at Cardigan with an expression somewhere between disbelief and rage. "Where's the Light Brigade?" Cardigan looked confused by the question, genuinely perplexed that anyone would ask. "I left them at the guns," he said, as if that explained everything, as if his duty was to lead the charge, not command it, as if what happened after he personally reached the objective was someone else's problem to solve. He found Lucan, reported formally that he'd carried out orders and reached the Russian battery as instructed, noted that casualties appeared to be substantial, but those details would be compiled by subordinate officers in due course. Then he rode to Balaclava harbor, where his private yacht was anchored, returned to his quarters aboard ship, changed into fresh clothes, had lunch prepared by his personal steward, and took a nap. The Light Brigade he'd led into the valley and then abandoned at the battery was being counted and sorted and bled over by surgeons who didn't have enough supplies or equipment to handle the volume of wounded arriving. Officers moved through the survivors, taking names, checking regiments, trying to separate the living from the missing from the confirmed dead. The numbers came in slowly, each regiment reporting separately, cross-referencing against morning muster rolls to identify who'd returned and who hadn't. The 17th Lancers had started with 145 men, 37 returned mounted and unwounded, another 20 returned wounded, rest were dead or captured or unaccounted for. The 13th Light Dragoons, 145 men at the start, only 10 came back mounted and unwounded, perhaps another 20 wounded, catastrophic losses that effectively deleted the regiment as a fighting force. The 11th Hussars, 110 men, 25 returned mounted and unwounded, casualties everywhere, gaps in every troop. The 4th Light Dragoons, 118 men, 39 back mounted and unwounded. The 8th Hussars, 104 men, 38 returned mounted. The total kept climbing as officers checked and rechecked, questioned survivors about men they'd seen fall, tried to sort confirmed dead from missing who might turn up later from captured who'd been taken prisoner. Final count took hours to compile, cross-referenced against multiple sources, yielded numbers that were somehow worse than the initial estimates. Killed, 110 men. Wounded, 129 men, many of whom wouldn't survive the night despite surgeons' efforts. Missing or captured, 58 men who'd been taken prisoner by Russians or were lying wounded in the valley beyond reach. Total casualties, 278 out of 670, 41%. The horses were worse because nobody counted horses individually. They were equipment, not personnel, but rough estimates suggested 475 horses killed or destroyed. 71% of the mounts that had started the charge. Some had been killed outright by artillery, others wounded so badly they had to be destroyed by British soldiers who walked the battlefield after fighting ended and put bullets in the heads of animals that were still alive, but would never recover. The 13th Light Dragoons had been effectively annihilated, 93% casualties, no longer existed as a fighting unit. The regimental standard had been captured, the colonel was dead, the surviving officers and men would be distributed to other units because there weren't enough of them left to reconstitute the regiment. Survivors sat on the ground or leaned against their horses, too exhausted to speak. Some were wounded but didn't realize it yet, shock masking pain, blood soaking their uniforms from cuts and punctures they'd taken during the fighting and hadn't registered in the chaos. Surgeon James Mowat moved among them, checking injuries, prioritizing who needed immediate treatment versus who could wait. He'd been a military surgeon for 12 years, served in India and Ireland, seen battle casualties in various contexts. He'd never seen anything like this. The concentration of casualties in such a short time, the variety of wounds from artillery and lance and saber and pistol, the mix of traumatic amputations and deep puncture wounds and compound fractures, all presenting simultaneously in numbers that exceeded his capacity to treat effectively. Tourniquet for the ones with arterial bleeding, field dressings for penetrating wounds, morphine for the ones who were dying and couldn't be saved but deserved to die without agony. The wounded who could survive surgery were loaded onto wagons for transport to the field hospital at Balaclava, 7 miles over rough roads that turned the journey into additional torture for men whose wounds jostled and tore with every bump and rut. Many wouldn't survive the trip, would bleed out or succumb to shock before reaching tables where surgeons could attempt repairs that might or might not work. On the valley floor, bodies lay where they'd fallen. British, Russian, horses mixed together in heaps around the artillery positions and strung out along the charge route like breadcrumbs, marking the path of destruction. Some of the wounded were still alive, calling for help, trying to crawl toward British lines that were too far away to reach on hands and knees. But nobody could retrieve them yet because the Russians still controlled the eastern half of the valley, and any attempt to recover casualties would draw fire. The ceasefire that would allow both sides to collect their dead and wounded wouldn't come for 2 days, which meant men lying in the grass with survivable injuries would die from exposure and blood loss and thirst long before anyone reached them. Private Albert Mitchell of the 13th Light Dragoons regained consciousness on the battlefield, with a Russian lancer standing over him, lance point positioned at his throat. Mitchell had been thrown from his horse during the fighting at the battery, hit his head on something, blacked out. When he came to, he was disarmed, wounded in the leg, surrounded by Russians who were collecting prisoners. He was taken with 57 other captured British cavalry, marched east away from British lines toward Russian positions deeper in Crimea. Some would be released in prisoner exchanges months later, their weight dropped from weeks of inadequate food, their health broken by dysentery and exposure, and the casual brutality of captivity. Others would die before exchanges could be arranged, buried in unmarked graves far from home. Up on the Sapoon Heights, 600 feet above the battlefield, Lord Raglan stood watching through his field glasses as survivors limped back to British lines. He'd sent an aide, Captain Ewart, down earlier with orders to stop the charge, but Ewart had arrived 20 minutes too late, found nothing but dead men and riderless horses where the Light Brigade had been forming up. Now Raglan watched the counting process, understood from the thin stream of returning riders that something catastrophic had occurred, that his orders had somehow resulted in the destruction of his finest cavalry unit. He turned to General Airy, the aide who'd written the original order, and spoke quietly, voice carefully controlled. They have sacrificed the Light Brigade. Not I sacrificed, not we sacrificed, they. Already the blame was shifting, the responsibility for disaster being redirected away from the commanding general who'd written ambiguous orders and toward subordinates who'd interpreted them incorrectly. Raglan's official dispatch, written that evening in his headquarters tent, would reflect this positioning. The charge was made with the utmost vigor and gallantry. The Light Brigade was unfortunately exposed to severe fire from batteries on both flanks. From some misconception of the order, to advance, the Light Brigade proceeded down the valley. Some misconception, passive voice, no agent identified, just a mistake that happened without anyone being specifically responsible for making it happen. Down in the valley, Lord Lucan found Lord Raglan near the headquarters area. The conversation was brief and bitter, witnessed by multiple staff officers who'd later record versions that differed in details but agreed on the essential content. Lucan's voice was tight with barely controlled fury. "You have lost the Light Brigade." Raglan's response was cold. "You have attacked the wrong objective. That was it. Two sentences that summarize the entire disaster, each man blaming the other for a failure that was really systemic, built into a command structure where aristocrats purchased rank and personal feuds overrode tactical judgment, and ambiguous orders got men killed because nobody wanted to ask for clarification and appear weak or incompetent. Lucan demanded a court-martial to clear his name, wanted formal proceedings where he could present evidence, call witnesses, demonstrate that the order he'd received was impossible to interpret correctly from his position in the valley. Raglan refused. A court-martial would require public airing of command dysfunction, would expose the toxic relationships and strategic incompetence that had led to Balaclava, would damage the British Army's reputation at a time when the Crimean campaign was already struggling with logistics failures and medical disasters. Better to quietly reassign Lucan, send him home without formal charges, let the whole mess fade into ambiguity where blame could be distributed vaguely instead of assigned specifically. In March 1855, 4 months after Balaclava, Raglan recalled Lucan to England. No court-martial, no formal investigation, just orders reassigning him away from Crimea. Lucan would spend the next 30 years writing letters, publishing pamphlets, giving speeches, attending military functions where he'd corner anyone who'd listen and explain his version of events, insist that he'd followed orders correctly and been made scapegoat for Raglan's incompetence. He never got his court-martial. The Army didn't want to revisit Balaclava officially, preferred to let it become legend rather than case study in command failure. Lord Cardigan returned to Britain in January 1855 as a hero. The British public didn't know he'd abandoned his men at the battery, didn't know he led from the front only in the most literal sense of riding ahead while taking no responsibility for what happened behind him. What they knew from newspaper reports was that he'd led a suicidal charge against impossible odds and survived, that he'd shown courage and determination and all the qualities Victorian England associated with military virtue. He was celebrated in London, attended parties where aristocrats toasted his bravery, received by Queen Victoria at Windsor, given honors and awards. He dined out on the story for the rest of his life, describing his role in heroic terms, never mentioning the part where he rode through the battery and kept going while his men fought and died without him. Captain Nolan, conveniently dead and unable to defend himself, became the scapegoat for those who wanted simple explanations. Officers who couldn't accept that Raglan's order was ambiguous or that Lucan had been placed in an impossible position claimed Nolan had deliberately misled Lucan, that his contempt for the cavalry leadership had caused him to give unclear directions out of spite or malice. Nolan's family tried to defend his reputation, published his writings on cavalry tactics to demonstrate his competence and professionalism, but dead men don't control their narratives. The story that stuck was that Nolan had made a mistake, pointed at the wrong objective, sent 670 men to their deaths through error or spite, died trying to fix it but too late to matter. Sergeant Major George Smith, who'd survived the charge and the fighting at the battery and the desperate ride back through artillery fire, returned to camp and immediately started looking for his men. Corporal Bradley was being treated by surgeons, dislocated shoulder reduced and set, shrapnel wounds cleaned and bandaged. Prognosis uncertain because infection was more dangerous than the original injuries and wouldn't manifest for days. Smith sat with him for 20 minutes, said nothing because there was nothing useful to say, just stayed present while Bradley processed shock and fear and the reality of being one of the survivors when so many weren't. Private Whiteman was sitting alone near the horse lines, uniform soaked in blood from his dead mount, staring at his hands which were shaking uncontrollably. Smith sat down next to him, didn't speak, just shared the space because sometimes presence mattered more than words. After 5 minutes, Whiteman's hands stopped shaking quite so badly. After 10 minutes, he looked at Smith and managed 3 words. "We did it," meaning they'd reached the guns, they'd hit the objective, they'd proven something about courage or duty or whatever abstract concept made riding into certain death seem meaningful instead of just wasteful. Smith nodded because agreeing was easier than explaining that reaching the guns hadn't mattered, that the strategic situation was unchanged, that they'd lost more than half their strength for no tactical gain. Let Whiteman believe it meant something. Maybe it did. Smith's own assessment, formed over 16 years of professional service and sharpened by watching 670 men ride into artillery fire on orders that made no tactical sense, was simpler and harder. They'd done their duty. They'd followed orders when refusing would have been court-martial offense. They'd stayed in formation when breaking would have exposed their mates to concentrated fire. They'd been professional soldiers executing commands from officers who didn't understand cavalry doctrine or terrain or basic military competence. The courage was real, the sacrifice was real, the pointlessness was also real, and acknowledging all three simultaneously was the burden of being NCO who survived when so many didn't. The British public learned about the charge in mid-November when dispatches reached London after 3 weeks' travel time. William Howard Russell, war correspondent for The Times, had watched the entire disaster from the Sapoon Heights next to Raglan's position. His report was published on November 14, 1854, and caused an immediate sensation. At 11:10, our Light Brigade rushed to the front, he wrote. The whole line of the enemy belched forth from 30 iron mouths a flood of smoke and flame. Through the clouds of smoke, we could see their sabers flashing. In another moment, we saw them riding through the guns. It was a feat of chivalry, fiery with consummate courage and bright with flashing valor. But was it war? That last question, was it war, captured the public reaction perfectly. Horror at the casualties mixed with intense pride in the courage displayed, confusion about how such disaster could occur, anger at leadership that would order cavalry into prepared artillery positions. The charge became simultaneously national shame and national glory, example of everything wrong with aristocratic military leadership and everything right about British martial spirit. 6 weeks later, Alfred Lord Tennyson published a poem that would define how Britain remembered Balaclava for the next century and a half. The charge of the Light Brigade appeared in the Examiner on December 9, 1854, written after Tennyson had read Russell's dispatch and been moved to commemorate courage he saw as quintessentially British. Half a league, half a league, half a league onward, all in the valley of death rode the 600. Forward the Light Brigade charged for the guns, he said. Into the valley of death rode the 600. The poem built to its famous line, "Theirs not to reason why theirs, but to do and die," which became the defining statement of the charge's meaning. Not a critique of blind obedience, but a celebration of it. Not a cautionary tale about incompetent leadership, but an anthem for soldiers who followed orders regardless of cost. The poem was instantly popular, reprinted in newspapers across Britain, recited in schools, memorized by children who learned that duty meant obeying without question, that courage meant charging when logic said retreat, that glory came from sacrifice even when sacrifice accomplished nothing. Tennyson had transformed disaster into legend, had taken 278 casualties and made them immortal, had ensured that Balaclava would be remembered not for the tactical failure it was, but for the heroism it contained. For the men who'd actually ridden into that valley, who'd felt artillery rounds passing inches from their heads, who'd seen their friends torn apart by canister shot. The poem was complicated. Pride in being recognized, anger at being mythologized, frustration that the courage was being celebrated, while the incompetence that necessitated it was being ignored. Smith read the poem months later when a copy reached Crimea, read it twice, put it down, never picked it up again. Theirs not to reason why, except reasoning was exactly what professional soldiers did, calculating odds and terrain and enemy capabilities, making tactical decisions that kept men alive when possible and spent them wisely when necessary. The poem made them sound like automatons, brave but mindless, noble but incapable of judgment. That wasn't who they'd been. They'd known the charge was wrong, had ridden anyway, because orders and duty and the knowledge that breaking formation would kill their mates. But knowing and choosing were different from blindly obeying. The distinction mattered even if poets couldn't see it. The strategic consequences of Balaclava were mixed and mostly negative for the British. The Light Brigade was destroyed as fighting force. Couldn't be reconstituted because there weren't enough surviving officers and men with cavalry experience. The remaining cavalry, mostly the heavy brigade plus whatever Light Brigade survivors could still ride, was used cautiously for the rest of the campaign, relegated to defensive picket duty and reconnaissance patrols. never committed to another major action because losing them would mean having no mobile force at all. British reconnaissance capabilities collapsed without light cavalry to scout enemy positions and screen friendly movements, leaving Raglan operating blind, dependent on informants and captured prisoners for intelligence about Russian dispositions. Winter was coming, the Crimean Winter of 1854-55 that would kill more British soldiers than all the battles combined. Disease, exposure, starvation. The supply line through Balaclava, the one the Light Brigade had supposedly died defending, proved inadequate for the logistics demands of siege warfare in sub-freezing temperatures. Cholera and dysentery swept through camps where sanitation was primitive and medical care was overwhelmed. Men died in trenches around Sevastopol, not from Russian bullets, but from preventable diseases and exposure. Thousands of casualties that could have been avoided with better planning and adequate supplies. Raglan remained in command until June 1855 when he died of dysentery, worked himself into exhaustion and illness, trying to salvage a campaign that had been mismanaged from the start. He was buried quietly, no state funeral. Government wanted him forgotten because keeping him visible meant keeping Crimean failures visible. The war itself dragged on until September 1855, when Sevastopol finally fell after 11 months of siege. The Treaty of Paris was signed in March 1856, ending hostilities with terms that accomplished Britain's strategic objective. Russian naval power in the Black Sea was neutralized. The Ottoman Empire survived as buffer state. Trade routes to India remained secure, but the cost in lives and money and reputation was staggering. More than 20,000 British soldiers dead, most from disease rather than combat. Hundreds of millions in expenses that bankrupted the treasury. International reputation damaged by revelations of military incompetence and logistical failures. The Crimean War exposed every failure of the British military system, gave reformers ammunition to demand changes that had been resisted for decades. The purchase of commissions, the system that let aristocrats buy military rank, regardless of competence, became politically untenable after Balaclava demonstrated what happened when wealthy incompetence commanded professional soldiers. The system wouldn't be fully abolished until 1871, but the Crimean disasters accelerated the process, made it impossible for defenders of aristocratic privilege to argue that birth and wealth were adequate qualifications for command. Staff colleges were established to train officers in actual military tactics instead of just parade ground drill and regimental history. Medical reforms, driven by Florence Nightingale's work in Crimean hospitals and her statistical analysis proving more soldiers died from preventable disease than combat, revolutionized military medicine and field sanitation. The charge of the Light Brigade became case study in every military academy, cautionary tale about communication failures and the importance of clear orders and the necessity of subordinates exercising judgment when orders made no tactical sense. Future generations of officers would study Balaclava and learn what not to do, though whether those lessons stuck was debatable given that military disasters driven by poor communication and rigid adherence to bad orders continued happening with depressing regularity. For Sergeant Major Smith, who survived the war and returned to England in 1856, the charge remained the defining event of his military career. He was 38 years old, had served 20 years, was offered promotion to regimental sergeant major, which he declined because he was done with cavalry and done with officers who purchased commissions and thought courage compensated for incompetence. He retired on pension, settled in Lancashire, married a woman he'd known before enlisting, worked various civilian jobs that seemed trivial compared to riding into artillery fire, but were safe and boring and exactly what he needed after Crimea. Corporal Bradley survived his wounds, recovered after months of treatment that left him with limited mobility in his right shoulder and chronic pain that would last the rest of his life. He was discharged as medically unfit for service, returned to Sussex, went back to farming. He rarely talked about Balaclava. When pressed at Village Pub, where locals wanted war stories, he'd say they did their duty and leave it at that, refused to elaborate or glorify, or make it sound like anything except what it was. Professional soldiers following orders that killed most of them. Private Whiteman lived until 1889, survived the war and decades afterward, worked on the docks in Cork, where his military service earned him some respect but no special privileges. He never applied for his medals, didn't want reminders of the worst day of his life sitting in a drawer somewhere. The battlefield itself was cleaned up slowly. Bodies were buried in mass graves, Russians and British separated, no markers except general locations recorded in quartermaster logs. Horses were left to rot, too many to bury, scavengers dealing with the carcasses over weeks and months. By 1856, when British officers returned to survey the area, the valley looked almost normal again, except for bones. White horse skeletons, still visible marking the charge route, scattered across grassland like archaeological evidence of disaster. Local civilians had collected anything useful, stripped equipment and weapons and brass buttons, left only bones and rust. By 1860, even the bones were gone, ground into soil or carried away by weather. Valley returned to what it had been before 670 men rode through it and died for reasons none of them fully understood. October 25th, 1854 remained in memory as the day British cavalry charged Russian artillery and lost 41% of their strength in 25 minutes. The day aristocratic incompetence and rigid obedience to ambiguous orders combined to destroy the finest light cavalry brigade in the British Army. The day courage and futility became impossible to separate because both were equally true. The Valley had asked a question that day, asked it of every man who rode through and every officer who ordered them, and every civilian who later read about it. When does obedience become complicity in your own destruction? When does following orders stop being duty and start being suicide? The Light Brigade hadn't answered that question, had just ridden forward and let history decide whether their courage mattered more than their deaths, or whether both mattered equally, or whether neither mattered at all in the long accounting of empires and wars and the mathematics of casualties that filled reports nobody would read a century later. The valley held no answers, just bones that turned to dust and grass that grew back in silence.